They called it treatment, but many women never returned the same. Behind those bright white doors were rooms no visitor ever fully understood, places where silence felt heavier than any diagnosis. What happened inside was spoken about softly, if spoken at all, as though the walls themselves demanded secrecy. Lives were changed in ways no one dared question, and entire stories were buried under polite smiles and closed curtains. Tonight, we step into that quiet world together, just long enough to hear what was never meant to be heard. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one listened closely to the conversations drifting through Victorian drawing rooms, it would be impossible not to notice how often the word hysteria surfaced, spoken with concern, embarrassment, or thinly veiled judgment. It was a term repeated casually the way people today complain about fatigue or stress. Yet in Victorian society it carried a weight far heavier than its vague meaning suggested. Women heard it whenever they raised their voices, whenever they looked too tired, whenever they hesitated or appeared anxious. The label drifted through families, workplaces, and clinics, attaching itself to nearly any behavior considered inconvenient or uncomfortable for those around them. Doctors claimed hysteria was a uniquely female disorder, rooted in the very organs that defined womanhood in their eyes. The idea itself had existed long before the Victorian period, but this era embraced it with unmatched enthusiasm. They saw it in women who fainted, women who spoke too eloquently, women who cried too easily, women who stayed silent too long. It became a convenient category, a drawer into which all unexplained emotions could be placed. The absence of precise symptoms made the diagnosis remarkably flexible. A woman could be healthy, active, and content, yet still be considered dangerously unstable if she reacted too strongly to the pressures around her. This vagueness allowed hysteria to function not as a medical condition, but as a social tool. Victorian society prided itself on order, morality, and restraint, especially among women. A respectable woman was expected to remain composed at all times. Any sign of agitation, whether caused by exhaustion, grief, or simply the weight of daily life, was treated as evidence that something inside her had gone awry. That belief served to protect the structure of the household and the authority of men, rather than the well-being of the women themselves. The diagnosis expanded rapidly. Newspapers printed stories of women collapsing in public. Doctors wrote pamphlets about nervous disorders, and popular lectures linked hysteria with everything from education to romantic novels. The more widely the term spread, the more ordinary it became. Families did not question whether the diagnosis was accurate. They relied on the authority of physicians who claimed expertise, even though they lacked a meaningful understanding of the human mind. In many homes, mothers warned daughters to control their tempers or risk being seen as hysterical. Girls grew up believing that emotions were dangerous, especially their own. It is unsettling to imagine how easily a woman's life could be shaped by a single word. Something as simple as speaking too sharply during an argument might draw suspicion. Crying privately but being overheard could be interpreted as instability. Feeling faint from hunger or heat might be labeled a symptom. Women who tried to assert themselves, whether against a husband, employer, or family member, risked being described as unwell. Even genuine medical conditions, such as anemia or hormonal changes, were often dismissed as manifestations of hysteria instead of being treated properly. Victorian society's fascination with hysteria reflected its broader struggle with female autonomy. As industrialization changed urban life and education became more accessible, women sought new roles and responsibilities. This shift threatened long-standing expectations about gender-prompting resistance, disguised as paternal concern. Declaring a woman hysterical allowed the community to maintain familiar boundaries while appearing compassionate. They could claim she needed rest, treatment, or moral guidance, anything except independence. Doctors played a central role in defining and perpetuating this belief. Many male physicians considered the female body inherently fragile, prone to collapse under emotional strain. They described women as naturally sensitive creatures whose nerves trembled at the slightest provocation. These ideas were not scientific but cultural, shaped by assumptions rather than evidence. Yet because they were presented in the language of medicine, they were rarely questioned. Families trusted doctors, and doctors trusted old theories that fit their worldview. The result was a system in which women were judged not by their health, but by their compliance. A quiet woman was considered stable. A cheerful woman was considered healthy. A woman who resisted expectations, who expressed frustration, refused instructions, or simply failed to remain composed, was treated as suspicious. The diagnosis of hysteria provided an easy justification for intervention. Sometimes that meant confinement in the home. Sometimes it meant visits to clinics that promised relief. And sometimes the consequences were far more severe. One of the most troubling aspects of this early stage in the history of hysteria is how normalized it all seemed. Families accepted the diagnosis because everyone else did. Doctors used the term because their peers supported it. The church approved because it aligned with moral teachings about female virtue. Even women themselves sometimes believed it, blaming their own emotions for things that were in truth responses to stress, grief, hunger, or mistreatment. Victorian culture created an environment where doubt was rare and questioning was frowned upon. This atmosphere allowed hysteria to function not merely as a label, but as a quiet warning. Women learned to monitor their expressions carefully. They hid their frustrations, swallowed their sadness, and forced cheerfulness when they were exhausted. Many lived in fear of being misunderstood. A simple misstep in behavior might lead to examinations, treatments, or social isolation. That fear lingered in homes, shaping conversations and silencing complaints. Emotional honesty became a luxury few women could afford. Looking back, it is difficult not to feel a cold sense of irony. A society obsessed with discipline and rationality created one of the most irrational diagnoses in medical history. It treated emotion as illness and obedience as health. The boundary between social discomfort and medical pathology blurred until they became indistinguishable. And in that blurred space, countless women lost their agency, their credibility, and in many cases their freedom. Everything described here reveals how a single word quietly defined the limits of women's lives. Yet this is only the beginning of how that word grew into an entire system of control. Somewhere behind a closed door, a different kind of treatment waited, one far stranger than the diagnosis that justified it. Victorian society placed great value on composure, and few expectations were enforced more strictly than the demand for emotional quietness in women. Everyday life unfolded under a framework where a woman's feelings were constantly monitored, not by formal rules, but by the steady pressure of social judgment. A respectable woman was expected to present herself as calm, agreeable, and steady no matter the circumstances around her. This ideal had little to do with reality, but it shaped how people interpreted even the smallest display of emotion. A woman who laughed too loudly in conversation was regarded as lacking dignity. A woman who cried openly was said to have weak nerves. Even a hint of restlessness, fidgeting, hands, tapping feet, a distracted gaze invited whispers about instability. These reactions became part of the rhythm of Victorian social life, learned early and repeated so often that they appeared natural. Families rarely questioned them. Daughters were corrected gently but persistently until they absorbed the message. Emotion was a danger, not a relief. This attitude did not emerge from medical understanding but from discomfort. Victorian households struggled to maintain the appearance of order, and emotion threatened that appearance. A woman expressing anger or distress unsettled the quiet facade that the era valued. Rather than acknowledging the causes of her feelings, society found it easier to mark the woman herself as the problem. In this way, emotional expression became entangled with moral judgment. A composed woman was virtuous. A troubled one was suspect. Still, life offered countless reasons for genuine distress. Poverty spread through crowded neighborhoods. Factories demanded long hours and relentless focus. Domestic servants carried the weight of endless chores, often sleeping little and earning less. Even wealthier women, insulated from the harshest economic realities, faced strict expectations regarding reputation and appearance. All lived under conditions that strained patience and health. Yet the social standard insisted they remain serene, as though external burdens held no influence. This contradiction made emotional expression appear abnormal, even when it was natural. When women showed signs of fatigue or sorrow, many observers interpreted these as failures of character rather than responses to difficult environments. This interpretation influenced not only families but also physicians. Doctors of the era frequently described women as biologically predisposed to irrationality, attributing nearly every emotional reaction to internal dysfunction. Such assumptions allowed medicine to validate society's fears, while disguising them as scientific truths. The medicalization of emotion intensified the pressure on women. When crying or shaking could be labeled as hysteria, every expression became risky. A spontaneous moment of frustration might be held against a woman for years. People began using medical language casually. A neighbor might say a woman suffered from nerves, or a husband might claim his wife needed rest. These phrases softened the judgment, but preserved the core idea her emotions were unhealthy, and she was responsible for controlling them. This mindset also affected how families managed conflict. Instead of acknowledging disagreements or misunderstandings, many attributed tension to a woman's supposed emotional fragility. If a wife resisted a decision, it was easier to question her stability than to consider her argument. If a daughter felt anxious or overwhelmed, her feelings were dismissed rather than addressed. Emotionally, women were treated as unreliable witnesses to their own lives, and eventually some learned to doubt themselves. The effect spread across all social classes. In wealthier households, the fear of gossip forced women to hide their emotions behind polite smiles. Servants, too, were expected to remain steady and unobtrusive, even when exhausted or ill. In poor neighborhoods where survival demanded constant effort, a woman who cried from stress might still be accused of being overly dramatic. Poverty did not soften expectations. It often made them harsher. The less control people had over their circumstances, the more they clung to strict norms of behavior. The belief that emotion indicated illness created a quiet form of coercion. Many women adjusted their behavior to avoid unwanted attention. They suppressed tears, hid anger, and masked fear. Even in private moments, they sometimes caught themselves performing calmness, as though being alone did not exempt them from scrutiny. The pressure to appear stable at all times left many isolated within their own minds, unable to express what they truly felt. At the same time, the constant labeling of emotion as hysteria blurred the line between ordinary distress and genuine medical conditions. A woman who suffered from chronic pain might be told her problem was emotional. A woman experiencing sadness from loss or trauma might receive no sympathy, only instructions to control herself. Misdiagnoses accumulated quietly, not out of cruelty, but out of a belief system that refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of female emotion. In this environment, the diagnosis of hysteria gained immense power. It offered an explanation that seemed scientific, while reinforcing social expectations. The label justified interventions, some mild and some severe. It served as a tool that shaped a woman's role within her household and within society. Because emotional expression was so tightly policed, nearly any deviation from the expected calmness could be interpreted as evidence of illness. And once the suspicion took root, it was difficult to escape. Looking back, the most unsettling aspect is not that women were judged emotionally, it is how normal the judgment appeared. Families, doctors, and communities participated in it without questioning its logic. They saw themselves as caretakers, not enforcers. They believed they were promoting stability, not suppressing individuality. The culture taught them that women were inherently at risk of emotional collapse, and they responded by creating the very conditions that encouraged silence. Everything described here reveals how society transformed ordinary emotion into a mark of instability. And once that belief took hold, it prepared the ground for spaces where women's feelings were not just judged, but treated. Behind certain quiet doors, those treatments began with routines far stranger than the reasons used to justify them. Hidden throughout Victorian towns were small establishments that called themselves clinics, though they bore little resemblance to hospitals. They were tucked behind narrow streets or placed discreetly above shops, marked only by modest signs or frosted windows. These places did not advertise openly. Their reputation moved quietly through families, suggested in hushed conversations, when a woman's behavior became difficult to explain. To the public eye, they maintained an appearance of professionalism. Yet anyone who stepped through their doors quickly understood they existed for a particular purpose, one that blurred the lines between treatment and control. These clinics accepted only women, a fact spoken of as though it were evidence of specialized care. In reality, the exclusion of men created an environment where female patients were isolated not only from society, but from those who might question what happened inside. The staff was overwhelmingly male. Doctors, attendants, and examiners carried the authority of education and social standing, while the women who entered the building were positioned as subjects who required guidance. Once admitted, a woman was expected to obey without hesitation. Her emotional state, physical comfort, and personal boundaries were regarded as secondary to the procedures the clinic deemed necessary. Families often sent women there with a mixture of relief and resignation. To them, these clinics offered a solution to behavior they did not understand. A wife who cried repeatedly, a daughter who resisted expectations, or a sister who could not maintain composure, each could be entrusted to the hands of professionals. Few asked what treatments were used, and fewer still considered whether the environment was meant to help or to contain. The belief that these clinics served a medical purpose was strong enough to silence doubt. Upon arrival, patients were stripped of their familiar surroundings. Their clothing was replaced with garments chosen by the clinic. Personal belongings were taken away for safekeeping. Visits from family members were limited or discouraged altogether. Even the layout of the buildings contributed to a sense of confinement. Narrow corridors led to small examination rooms with heavy doors. Windows were often high and opaque, admitting light but offering no view of the outside world. The design made it easy for the clinic to manage its residents, and nearly impossible for the women to feel grounded in their own identities. The routines inside these clinics were presented as therapeutic, but they functioned primarily as mechanisms of control. Women were instructed to rest in silence for long periods, as though stillness could mend the emotions that brought them there. They were observed during meals, exercise sessions, and examinations. Every gesture was noted, every change in mood interpreted through the lens of instability. A woman who spoke too little was called withdrawn. A woman who spoke too much was called agitated. In this environment, neutrality did not exist. Everything she did became evidence for the diagnosis the clinic had already accepted. The authority of the male doctors shaped the atmosphere completely. Their presence commanded obedience. They entered rooms without warning, asked questions without waiting for comfort, and carried out procedures without explaining them fully. Women were expected to trust that these men knew what was best, even when the treatments contradicted their instincts or caused discomfort. The imbalance of power was unmistakable. A woman's word held little value when weighed against the doctor's opinion. If she expressed fear or confusion, these reactions were interpreted as further symptoms rather than legitimate concerns. Despite the clinical appearance of these establishments, morality seeped into every decision. Treatments were chosen not only for their supposed medical benefit, but for their ability to restore a woman to what society considered proper. A patient who expressed anger was encouraged or coerced to behave gently. A woman accused of being overly emotional was instructed to adopt calmness. These goals aligned with social expectations more than with health. The clinic positioned itself as a place where women were corrected, reshaped, and returned to their families as more manageable versions of themselves. Isolation amplified the psychological effects of these practices. Deprived of familiar voices and routines, many women began doubting their own perceptions. They questioned whether their behavior truly indicated illness. They wondered whether obedience might be the only path to release. Over time, even the strongest personalities found their resistance eroded. The clinic's environment did not require force. It relied on quiet, methodical pressure that wore down a woman's confidence until she accepted the narrative imposed on her. These clinics were not secret, yet most people preferred not to think about them. Their existence was an uncomfortable reminder that society had little interest in understanding women's emotions, only in containing them. The fact that these places operated quietly and without significant oversight reflected a widespread belief that questionable treatments were justified if they produced compliant behavior. Families avoided asking what happened behind closed doors because asking invited responsibility. It was simpler to believe that the clinics offered healing. Looking back, their purpose becomes painfully clear. They were not sanctuaries for troubled women, but instruments used to enforce the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The staff claimed authority through medicine, but the underlying motivation was always social order. These clinics offered reassurance to family structure to doctors and silence from the women who entered. The environments they created, sterile rooms, locked doors, and constant supervision, did not foster recovery. They fostered conformity. Everything described here shows how treatment served more as containment than as care. And within those confined rooms, the next layer of methods revealed intentions far darker than the polite exterior suggested. From a quieter corner of the clinic, certain practices waited in ways no patient could fully anticipate. Victorian medicine claimed to identify hysteria through an impressive list of symptoms. Yet the more closely one examines that list, the more apparent it becomes that almost anything could qualify. Doctors described the disorder as though it were a shifting presence capable of hiding itself in sleeplessness, stomach tension, fainting spells, or trembling hands. A woman who tossed restlessly at night might be told her nerves were failing. Another who felt weak from hunger or stress might be diagnosed with internal agitation. Even when physical causes were evident, physicians frequently attributed the discomfort to emotional instability rather than practical explanations. Because the definition of hysteria changed from case to case, the diagnosis expanded rapidly. Women with no notable health problems found themselves labeled as unwell simply because their behavior did not match expectations. A woman who sighed too often, stared into the distance, or seemed distracted during a conversation invited suspicion. Some physicians believed hysteria manifested in prolonged silence. Others insisted it revealed itself through excessive talking. These contradictions did not trouble the medical community. Instead, they gave doctors wide authority to interpret behavior as they wished. In many clinics, even perfectly ordinary reactions were treated as meaningful signs. A patient who flinched during an examination might be called hypersensitive. A woman who avoids eye contact could be described as withdrawn. Someone who asked too many questions risked being seen as anxious or resistant. The very flexibility of the symptoms ensured that no woman was entirely safe from diagnosis. Under the right conditions, her daily habits could be transformed into evidence of a disorder she did not have. One of the most troubling aspects of this vague system was how it aligned with social expectations. If a woman expressed anger at unfair treatment, the anger was labeled a symptom. If she felt sadness after a loss, the grief was seen as evidence of imbalance. Even fatigue, common in a world of long work hours and poor nutrition, became a mark of instability. This allowed society to dismiss female emotion without addressing the circumstances that caused it. Instead of asking why a woman felt overwhelmed, people asked what was wrong with her. Doctors often relied on brief observations rather than thorough examinations. A woman's posture, tone of voice, or hesitation during a conversation could be enough to secure a diagnosis. Many physicians assumed that women were prone to exaggeration, so complaints were viewed with suspicion. Conversely, if a woman remained calm while describing discomfort, her composure might be interpreted as emotional suppression. In either case, the conclusion remained the same. Hysteria was always a possibility, and frequently the chosen explanation. The lack of consistency extended beyond symptoms to the supposed causes of the disorder. Some doctors argued that hysteria arose from overexertion. Others believed it came from idleness. Still others claimed that reading novels, attending parties, or engaging in intellectual activities placed women at risk. In a society already concerned about the proper role of women, these theories offered a convenient justification for limiting their activities. The more hysteria could be blamed on deviation from expected behavior, the easier it was to enforce those expectations. Families absorbed these beliefs quickly, often without realizing how deeply they shaped their decisions. A mother might bring her daughter to a clinic because she appeared nervous during social gatherings. A husband might encourage treatment because his wife seemed withdrawn after childbirth. Friends might whisper concerns when a woman expressed dissatisfaction with her routine. By framing ordinary challenges as medical problems, families avoided confronting issues they did not want to discuss. Medicine became a way to silence discomfort rather than address it. Over time, many women began to internalize the idea that they were fragile, unstable, or ill-equipped to navigate their own lives. When doctors interpreted their symptoms as hysteria, it reinforced a sense of guilt or failure. Even women who felt physically well sometimes doubted their health simply because others insisted something was wrong. This self-doubt weakened their ability to resist further interventions, making them more vulnerable to the practices carried out in clinics. In institutional settings, the consequences became even more pronounced. A woman's records listed symptoms she had never expressed, described behaviors she had never displayed, and included observations influenced by the biases of those watching her. Once documented, these descriptions were rarely questioned. The diagnosis gained authority simply by existing on paper. Even if a woman improved, her recovery was credited to treatment rather than to any flaw in the original assumptions. The cycle continued smoothly, uninterrupted by scrutiny. The vagueness of hysteria's symptoms also allowed doctors to broaden their reach. A woman who complained of headaches or dizziness could be admitted for observation. Another who suffered from stress or exhaustion could be recommended for treatment. In some cases, the process began not with a request for help, but with a suggestion from a physician who believed he recognized warning signs. Women who had not sought care found themselves evaluated and categorized before they fully understood what was happening. Looking back, the system appears both elaborate and empty, full of terminology, yet lacking clarity, full of diagnoses, yet short on understanding. Hysteria grew powerful not because it was well-defined, but because it could be adapted endlessly to suit the needs of doctors and the fears of society. It explained nearly everything, and therefore explained nothing. Still, its influence shaped countless lives, slipping quietly into homes, clinics, and hospitals under the guise of medical authority. Everything described here reveals how ambiguity became a convenient tool for labeling women as unwell. And once the diagnosis settled over their lives, the treatments prescribed carried intentions far more constraining than healing. In the dim rooms of certain clinics, methods emerged that women rarely anticipated until they were already underway. In Victorian society, female emotion was not merely observed, it was monitored with the vigilance one might reserve for signs of contagion. A woman who raised her voice during an argument, even briefly, could be judged as losing control. If she sighed too often, appeared tired, or expressed irritation after a long day, whispers about her nerves began to circulate. These reactions were so common in daily life that they should have been unremarkable, yet the cultural lens of the era magnified them into markers of instability. In many homes, something as simple as a frown at the wrong moment invited concern. People believed they were protecting order by interpreting these reactions as symptoms. The assumption that women were naturally prone to emotional excess meant that even mild expressions were treated as potential signs of illness. When a woman protested injustice or expressed dissatisfaction, her words were not evaluated for meaning. They were evaluated for tone. A firm voice suggested agitation. A sharp remark hinted at mental strain. It required little effort for bystanders to reinterpret her feelings as something pathological. This subtle shift allowed ordinary frustration to be interpreted as evidence that she needed intervention. The medical system embraced this idea with surprising ease. Instead of questioning whether external circumstances caused distress, doctors focused on diagnosing the internal state of the woman herself. They claimed that emotional sensitivity, irritability, or sadness were symptoms of a deeper disruption within the female body. Medical descriptions portrayed women as creatures ruled by hidden forces, helpless before their own physiology. This belief absolved society of responsibility. If a woman felt overwhelmed, the problem lay in her nerves, not in the expectations placed upon her. Because the diagnosis of hysteria was so flexible, it served as a ready-made explanation for nearly any emotional expression. A woman complaining about unfair treatment might be told she was overwrought. One who cried after a personal loss might be warned that her grief was dangerous if left untreated. Even laughter, if it seemed too sudden or too enthusiastic, could attract criticism. In this world, stability was not defined by emotional health but by compliance. A woman who questioned her circumstances risked being labelled unwell simply because her feelings disrupted the facade of harmony. Under these assumptions, treatment is rarely aimed at understanding. Its purpose was to quiet what others found disruptive. Physicians recommended rest, cures, isolation, and sedating medications. These interventions did not address the sources of distress. Instead, they softened a woman's voice until it could no longer challenge those around her. A patient who emerged from treatment subdued and agreeable was considered improved even if nothing in her life had changed. Silence was mistaken for healing. Families adopted the same logic. When a woman's frustration became uncomfortable, they urged her to seek medical help rather than examine the pressures she faced. Many women internalized this message, believing that their emotions reflected personal weakness rather than stress, exhaustion, or mistreatment. Some felt guilt for speaking their minds, while others learned to temper their reactions to avoid further scrutiny. Over time, the fear of appearing unstable influenced their behavior more than any formal rule. This dynamic made emotion itself dangerous. Ordinary reactions, anger at a harsh comment, sadness after disappointment, or anxiety during uncertainty, became risks that could lead to evaluation or confinement. Women monitored themselves, constantly adjusting their tone, posture, and expressions to avoid drawing attention. The pressure to appear calm at all times created a quiet, persistent tension. Many lived in a state of emotional caution, navigating each day as though walking across a surface that might crack beneath them. The medical system reinforced this fear by framing emotion as a physiological threat. Doctors insisted that unchecked feelings could cause physical harm, claiming that intense sorrow or anger might destabilize the body's internal balance. These ideas lacked evidence but carried authority because they mirrored social fears. When medicine echoed cultural beliefs, its prescriptions gained greater power. A diagnosis from a doctor validated anxieties already present within families, making it easier to justify treatments that suppressed emotion rather than explored its causes. Once labeled, a woman often struggled to regain credibility. Any attempt to explain herself might be interpreted as resistance. Denying the diagnosis could be taken as proof of its accuracy. Efforts to express calmness were dismissed as temporary. A single moment of visible distress might undo weeks of stability. In this way, the diagnosis became a trap. A woman caught within it found that the very act of defending her emotions was used against her. The consequences extended far beyond the clinic. By pathologizing emotion, Victorian society undermined women's confidence in their own perceptions. Doubt seeped into their sense of self. They questioned whether their feelings were valid, whether their reactions were allowed, and whether their voices carried meaning. The pressure to suppress emotion did not make life easier. It made it quieter, lonelier, and far more constrained. Looking back, the pattern becomes disturbingly clear. What was described as care functioned as discipline. What was presented as treatment served as silencing. The medicalization of female emotion provided a framework that excused social discomfort and avoided deeper questions about inequality, overwork, and unmet needs. By calling emotion an illness, society protected itself from examining why women felt distressed in the first place. Everything described here reveals how emotion became a pretext for quieting women rather than understanding them. And once silence was accepted as the measure of recovery, the path opened for treatments that blurred the boundary between medicine and punishment. From deeper within those clinics, methods awaited that women rarely recognized until they were already seated in the examination chair. Among the many beliefs that guided Victorian medical practice, few were as revealing or as troubling as the notion that a woman's uterus could roam freely inside her body. Doctors inherited this idea from ancient theories and repeated it with surprising confidence, as though centuries of repetition had transformed speculation into truth. They described the womb as a restless organ, capable of drifting upward into the chest, pressing against the lungs, or even disturbing the brain. Any discomfort a woman experienced could be interpreted through this lens. Difficulty breathing, sudden anxiety, chest tightness. These sensations were not signs of exhaustion or grief, but evidence that the womb had wandered to a place it did not belong. This belief was not merely strange, it shaped real decisions. When a woman complained of shortness of breath, doctors often insisted that her reproductive organs were to blame. If she felt tension in her chest or fluttering in her throat, they attributed it to the womb pushing upward. Because the theory lacked clear limits, almost any symptom could support it. The more a woman spoke about her distress, the more her words were used to confirm the diagnosis. Her body became a puzzle that only men claimed the authority to decipher, even though their interpretations relied more on superstition than science. In many households, families accepted these explanations without question. People were accustomed to thinking of women as governed by internal forces they could not control. The idea that an invisible movement inside the body might cause emotional or physical discomfort made intuitive sense to them, even if it lacked evidence. Women who felt anxious or overwhelmed were told their womb was misbehaving. They were advised to rest, avoid excitement, and submit to treatments that promised to coax the organ back into place. These suggestions often provided reassurance to families, even while offering little comfort to the women themselves. The belief in the wandering womb also offered a convenient way to dismiss female emotion. If a woman expressed fear, the problem was not the circumstances she faced, but the location of her uterus. If she felt sadness, doctors described it as a mechanical disturbance rather than a human response. This reasoning allowed society to ignore the causes of distress. It was easier to blame an organ than to confront the pressures of marital expectations, economic hardship, or social isolation. The body became a scapegoat, absorbing responsibility for every discomfort. Treatments based on this theory ranged from harmless rituals to invasive procedures. Some doctors recommended fragrant herbs or scented oils, believing that pleasant smells would lure the womb downward. Others advised strong, unpleasant odors to drive it away from the chest. These practices resembled superstition more than medicine, yet they were presented with scientific authority. Women were instructed to breathe deeply, remain still, or lie in particular positions to guide the organ's return. A few physicians employed mechanical devices intended to restrain the womb, though the discomfort often exceeded any perceived benefit. The underlying message of these treatments was unmistakable. A woman's body was unpredictable, and she required guidance to keep it under control. This reinforced the stereotype of female fragility. It also justified interventions that limited autonomy. If a woman's uterus could roam unpredictably, then her freedom could be portrayed as dangerous. Movement, excitement, or emotional strain were treated as risks that might provoke internal chaos. The theory blurred the line between physical health and moral expectations. Keeping a woman calm, quiet, and restrained was presented as a medical necessity rather than a social preference. This blending of superstition and gender bias shaped how women understood themselves. Many grew fearful of sensations that in another era would have been considered ordinary. A flutter of the heart became alarming. A moment of anxiety seemed catastrophic. Women were taught to interpret their internal experiences through a lens of suspicion, believing that their bodies were constantly on the verge of betraying them. This self-monitoring deepened their vulnerability, making them more dependent on the doctors who claimed expertise. Medical authority reinforced these fears. Physicians wrote confidently about the dangers of uterine displacement, describing it as a threat to both physical and emotional stability. They warned families that without proper treatment, the wandering organ could cause lasting harm. These warnings, expressed with certainty, made it difficult for women to reject the diagnosis. Even those who doubted the theory lacked the social power to question it openly. Their voices carried little weight against the established wisdom of the time. The endurance of this belief also exposed the limitations of Victorian science. Despite advances in other fields, assumptions about women's bodies often went unchallenged. Emotional distress was still seen as a weakness inherent to femininity, and the theory of the wandering womb provided a tidy explanation that supported existing prejudices. By clinging to superstition, the medical system avoided confronting the deeper issues that shaped women's health: exhaustion, malnutrition, overwork, and the constant pressure to conform. In this environment, women who sought help often found themselves trapped within a narrative that refused to recognize their humanity. Their symptoms were interpreted through a framework designed not to understand but to manage. A woman might enter a clinic hoping for relief, only to discover that her experiences were being molded to fit theories that predated her by centuries. She became the subject of treatments that addressed neither her needs nor her reality. Looking back, the idea of a wandering womb seems absurd, yet its impact was anything but. It shaped how women were treated, how they were judged, and how they viewed themselves. By attributing emotional and physical distress to an imaginary internal movement, Victorian society transformed superstition into authority and used it to reinforce boundaries already drawn by gender. Everything described here shows how superstition merged with medicine to justify control over women's bodies. And as these beliefs deepened, the treatments applied grew increasingly bold, framed as remedies but practiced as restraint. Within the deeper corners of those clinics, certain methods waited quietly, shaping experiences no patient could fully prepare for. The treatments offered inside Victorian women's clinics were often described with gentle language, chosen carefully to soothe families and reassure patients. Words like relaxation, comfort, and restoration appeared frequently in pamphlets and conversations. Yet the methods behind these terms bore little resemblance to the calm imagery they suggested. Women were seated in specially designed chairs that vibrated or rocked with a steady mechanical force. Others were guided into small rooms filled with dense herbal steam, the air so thick it blurred their vision and muffled their sense of direction. All of this was presented as therapy, though the true purpose was far more complicated than healing. The steaming chambers were particularly striking. They were small, often barely larger than a wardrobe, with walls that trapped heat until the space felt suffocating. Women entered, clothed in loose garments, instructed to remain still as the room filled with vapor. Doctors claimed that certain herbs calmed the nerves or stimulated circulation, though these assertions were rarely supported by evidence. In reality, the heat and humidity produced a kind of dazed exhaustion. Women emerged with flushed faces, heavy limbs, and clouded thoughts, too tired to protest or question the process. Some clinics preferred heated oils instead of steam. Attendants applied the oils in slow, repetitive motions across the patient's back, arms, or legs, insisting this would soothe overstimulated nerves. The warmth did create a sense of physical softness, but it also dulled awareness. Many women described feeling lightheaded or detached afterward. Because the treatments hovered between comfort and discomfort, they blurred the line between relaxation and vulnerability. A patient who began the session fully alert might leave in a state where her reactions seemed lethargic or muted, an outcome the clinics often interpreted as improvement. The most controversial instruments were the vibrating chairs. These devices were marketed as innovations in modern medicine, capable of restoring balance to the nervous system. Women sat on them, while the machine produced rapid rhythmic movements that coursed through their bodies. Some found the sensation bewildering, others embarrassing. Doctors, however, emphasized the therapeutic value of the vibrations, claiming they released tension and stabilized emotional irregularities. This narrative masked the fact that the devices often elicited reactions that were intimate, disorienting, or involuntary. Because these procedures took place behind closed doors, their ambiguity offered protection to the clinics. Families heard only the sanitized explanations, unaware of how the treatments affected patients physically or emotionally. Women who felt uncomfortable rarely complained. Doing so risked being labeled uncooperative or resistant to care. Their silence reinforced the illusion that the clinics knew best. Even when a woman left a session trembling or weakened, staff assured her that such responses were signs of the therapy taking effect. The language surrounding these treatments reveals much about Victorian thinking. By calling them restorative clinics, obscured the actual purpose to produce compliance. A woman who was exhausted by heat, overwhelmed by sensation, or lulled into passivity was easier to manage. She argued less, questioned less, and felt less capable of resisting the authority of the practitioners around her. The treatments did not aim to address her emotional needs, but to soften her into a more controlled state. Some doctors may have believed sincerely in the value of these methods. Others likely understood their usefulness in maintaining order within the clinic. Regardless of intention, the effect was the same. Women were subjected to procedures that manipulated their bodies under the guise of healing their minds. These treatments created an environment where physical reaction replaced emotional expression and fatigue replaced confrontation. The clinics justified their choices by invoking the concept of overstimulation, a popular explanation in Victorian medicine. They argued that modern life overwhelmed women's delicate nerves and that only targeted intervention could restore balance. The treatments, they claimed, drained away excess energy or redirected internal forces. Because these theories lacked clear definitions, they were nearly impossible to disprove. Women were judged not by their experiences but by the interpretations of those observing them. For many patients, the most unsettling aspect was not the treatments themselves, but the atmosphere surrounding them. The rooms were dim, the attendants silent, the procedures repetitive. There was an unspoken expectation that women would accept the sensations without questioning their purpose. The combination of heat, pressure, and mechanical movement gradually wore down their awareness. By the time the session ended, they often felt too disoriented to articulate what they had endured. These methods reinforced a larger pattern. Emotional expression was not something to be understood, but something to be subdued. Treatments did not encourage conversation or reflection. They encouraged stillness, heaviness, and resignation. A woman who appeared calmer afterward was deemed successful, even if her quietness came from exhaustion rather than relief. The clinics mistook silence for stability, failing to see that their methods produced only temporary compliance. Looking back, the strangeness of these practices becomes impossible to ignore. They combined elements of comfort, coercion, and confusion wrapped in language that disguised their intentions. The treatments reveal how little Victorian society understood women's emotional lives and how far it was willing to go to reshape behavior under the banner of medicine. Steam, heat, and vibration were not chosen because they healed, but because they controlled. Everything described here shows how supposed relaxation became a subtle method of reducing resistance. And once these practices gained legitimacy, they opened the way for even more intrusive methods disguised as care. From deeper inside those quiet halls, other treatments lingered in ways no patient could fully anticipate. Among the many methods used in Victorian clinics, the pelvic massage stands out not only for its strangeness, but for the confidence with which doctors defended it. They described it as a legitimate medical procedure intended to relieve nervous tension, restore internal balance, and calm emotional disturbances. The language they used was clinical, detached, and authoritative. Yet behind the formal terminology lay an uncomfortable truth. The treatment involved intimate contact, performed without genuine consent, explanation, or acknowledgement of its implications. For many physicians, the procedure was routine. They approached it as though it were no different from examining a patient's heartbeat or prescribing a tonic. This attitude reflected the era's medical culture, which rarely considered women's perspectives essential to treatment. Patients were expected to obey instructions, quietly trusting in the expertise of the doctor standing over them. Even when a woman felt fear or confusion, her reactions were dismissed as further evidence of the nervous condition the clinic claimed to treat. The procedure itself was framed as a way to induce paroxysm, a term used to describe the physical release that doctors believed would alleviate symptoms of hysteria. They argued that this release allowed pent-up emotional energy to escape the body, reducing anxiety and restoring composure. The explanation sounded scientific enough to families unfamiliar with the details. Few understood how personal the process truly was, and fewer still questioned it openly. Doctors relied on this silence to maintain authority. Women undergoing the treatment often found themselves in vulnerable positions both physically and emotionally. They were placed on examination tables or reclining chairs, instructed to relax while the doctor performed techniques he claimed were necessary. Without consent or a clear understanding, patients were left to interpret the sensations as best they could. Some felt profound discomfort. Others experienced reactions they could not articulate. Whatever their feelings, the clinic rarely acknowledged them. The focus remained on achieving the desired outcome, a euphemism that obscured the intimate nature of what was being done. The procedure's legitimacy rested heavily on the belief that women were too fragile or uninformed to comprehend their own needs. Doctors insisted that they alone understood the workings of the female body. This assumption created a wide gap between practitioner and patient, one that allowed questionable practices to flourish under the banner of professionalism. The patriarchal structure of medical authority ensured that women's experiences were overshadowed by the interpretations of the men treating them. Families too contributed to the persistence of the method. They heard only that the clinic offered effective treatment for hysteria. Because emotional expression was already viewed with suspicion, the promise of a procedure that could calm a woman and restore order appealed to them. Mothers, husbands, and siblings delivered women into the clinic's care, believing they were acting responsibly. They rarely asked what occurred during sessions, choosing trust over inquiry. This blind reliance strengthened the clinic's ability to operate without scrutiny. Inside the treatment rooms, the atmosphere was quiet and controlled. Doctors worked efficiently, their movements precise, as though the procedure were entirely detached from emotion. Attendants assisted without speaking unless necessary. The room's silence heightened the sense that the woman's feelings were irrelevant. She existed only as a patient to be managed, a body whose reactions were observed but not acknowledged as meaningful. Once the session was complete, she was expected to rest briefly, regain composure, and return to the clinic's general routine. One of the most troubling aspects of the treatment was how thoroughly it blurred the line between medical intervention and violation. Doctors insisted that because their intentions were therapeutic, the procedure was beyond criticism. They claimed objectivity where none truly existed. By framing the treatment as necessary, they dismissed any discomfort women expressed. If a patient seemed shaken, she was told the procedure had worked. If she remained tense, she was told she needed additional sessions. The outcome never challenged the premise. The procedure also reflected society's broader discomfort with female sexuality. Women were not encouraged to understand their own bodies, and openly discussing desire was considered improper. This secrecy allowed clinics to treat deeply intimate contact as though it were purely mechanical. Patients had few words to describe what they experienced. Cultural norms ensured their silence. In this setting, confusion served the clinic well. The fewer women who understood, the easier it was for the treatment to continue unquestioned. Looking back, the procedure appears startlingly invasive, yet it persisted because the era provided ideal conditions for it. Medical authority went largely unchallenged. Social expectations limited women's voices. Families relied on experts without demanding transparency. Clinics operated behind doors that remained closed, not by force but by custom. The pelvic massage treatment thrived in this landscape, not because it healed, but because it fit comfortably into a system built on unquestioned control. The method endured until technological alternatives emerged, allowing clinics to distance themselves from the directness of the procedure. But its legacy reveals a disturbing truth. Victorian medicine often prioritized compliance over care, convenience over dignity, and authority over understanding. The treatment was less a response to illness than an assertion of power disguised in clinical language. Everything described here shows how easily medical authority could overshadow bodily autonomy. And once such practices were accepted, they encouraged treatments that extended even further into women's private lives. In certain examination rooms, Devices awaited that claimed precision yet carried consequences few women were prepared to face. In Victorian clinics, authority rested firmly in the hands of male doctors, whose presence shaped every decision, every procedure, and every interpretation of a woman's condition. They were regarded not only as medical experts but as guardians of order, entrusted with restoring calm, where emotion had supposedly disrupted balance. The weight of their authority filled the hallways long before any treatment began. When a doctor entered a room, conversations ceased, attendants straightened their posture, and patients prepared themselves for instructions they had no power to question. These doctors decided everything. They determined which symptoms mattered, which behaviors required attention, and which treatments a woman would receive. Their diagnoses shaped the lives of their patients far more than any actual medical discovery. Because hysteria lacked a clear definition, the doctor's interpretation became truth by default. A woman's own understanding of her condition held no influence. Even if she insisted she was not ill, her denial could be reframed as resistance, a sign in the doctor's eyes that treatment was necessary. The imbalance of power between doctor and patient was not accidental, but deeply rooted in cultural assumptions. Victorian society praised male rationality and dismissed female emotional insight, positioning men as natural authorities over women's bodies. Doctors absorbed these beliefs and practiced accordingly. They saw themselves as interpreters of women's experiences, even when those experiences were described directly by the women themselves. As long as the doctor believed he understood her condition better than she did, her role remained passive. Many women reported feeling a distinct shift the moment an examination began. The doctor's tone, his confidence, and the finality of his words combined to create an atmosphere of inevitability. He did not simply suggest treatments, he declared them. His authority left no space for refusal. A woman could not negotiate or ask for clarification without risking suspicion. Any hesitation might be seen as a symptom. In such an environment, compliance became the only safe response. The power dynamic extended far beyond the treatment room. Doctors communicated with families, influencing how a woman was perceived within her own household. If he claimed she was fragile, her relatives treated her accordingly. If he insisted she required rest or isolation, they enforced it without question. His opinion shaped her daily routine, her social interactions, even her ability to express herself. Few figures outside the home carried such influence, and fewer still wielded it so quietly. Patients felt this pressure acutely. Many described a lingering sense of humiliation that stayed with them long after the treatment ended. During examinations, their vulnerability was magnified by the clinic's routines. Garments removed, positions, adjusted movements, directed by hands that belonged to someone they barely knew. Women were expected to tolerate these intrusions without protest, absorbing them as necessary aspects of care. But beneath the surface, the experience carved deep emotional marks. Fear became a quiet companion. Some women dreaded their appointments, sensing that the doctor's authority left no room for their discomfort. Others felt trapped by the knowledge that refusing treatment could lead to harsher interventions. A few learned to hide their true feelings, presenting themselves in ways that minimized attention. These strategies reflected not paranoia, but self-preservation. In a system where a doctor's judgment could override a woman's own voice, caution became a logical response. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this dynamic was how ordinary it appeared to those within it. Doctors believed they were acting responsibly, fulfilling duties expected of their profession. Families trusted the system because it promised control over behavior they found troubling. Women complied because resistance seemed futile. The structure relied not on overt violence, but on silent acceptance, each person fulfilling a role that reinforced the doctor's power. Even when treatments caused distress, the system shielded the doctor from scrutiny. If a woman emerged shaken from a procedure, her reaction was framed as evidence of the illness being treated. If she expressed anger at her experience, that too became a symptom. The circular logic left no room for critique. A doctor's methods remained unquestioned because the framework reinterpreted every negative response as proof of his necessity. This dynamic also influenced how clinics defined success. Improvement was measured not by a woman's sense of well-being, but by her behavior. If she grew quieter, she was considered stable. If she ceased expressing dissatisfaction, she was seen as cured. Compliance became the primary indicator of progress. Under such criteria, the doctor's authority strengthened with every subdued patient, even if her silence came from exhaustion or resignation rather than recovery. Looking back, the structure becomes painfully clear. The doctor stood at the top of a hierarchy designed to maintain control rather than foster healing. His authority shaped the emotional atmosphere of the clinic, dictating who held power and who remained submissive. Women entered seeking help, but often found themselves navigating a system that viewed their vulnerability as justification for further intrusion. The imbalance defined their experiences far more than the treatments themselves. Everything described here reveals how authority overshadowed care, leaving women powerless within the very spaces meant to treat them. And as that authority solidified, it prepared the ground for practices that blurred the line between medical necessity and moral judgment. Along the quieter corridors of these clinics, tools awaited that claimed precision while carrying consequences no woman fully understood before they touched her skin. The deeper one looks into Victorian clinics, the harder it becomes to understand where medicine ended and something far more unsettling began. Many of the treatments for hysteria were defended fiercely by the doctors who practiced them, framed as scientific advances capable of restoring a woman's composure. Yet the methods themselves often involved intimate contact, forced compliance, and procedures designed to provoke reactions that clinics never explained openly. These contradictions created a landscape in which the language of healing masked the logic of domination. The clinics operated under an assumption so deeply rooted that few questioned it. Women were not reliable interpreters of their own experiences. Because of this belief, doctors justified interventions that disregarded consent entirely. When a woman expressed discomfort, they interpreted it as a symptom. When she expressed fear, they called it nervous excitation. No reaction could undermine the doctor's authority because the system was built to reinterpret every response as further proof of illness. This created a closed circle of power in which treatment always validated itself. The procedures offered often carried an unmistakable undertone of control. A woman placed on a vibrating chair, rubbed with heated oils or manipulated through pelvic massage, found herself responding to sensations she did not choose. These responses were then used to claim therapeutic success, even though they said more about the body's reflexes than about emotional healing. The doctors, however, presented themselves as benevolent guides helping women achieve release from inner turmoil. Their confidence masked the troubling reality that women had no rightful space to object. In many cases, women were encouraged to believe that any discomfort they felt was necessary. The clinics repeated the idea that illness required discipline, that the body needed to be managed firmly to recover. Treatments that bordered on violation were reframed as instruments of moral correction. Because hysteria was linked to perceived excess emotion, the solution from the clinic's perspective involved stripping away autonomy. A woman who submitted quietly was said to be progressing. A woman who resisted only confirmed the diagnosis that brought her there. The treatments blurred into something else when observed closely. The gestures used, the positions required, and the silence enforced during sessions carried implications that the doctors refused to acknowledge. Women were touched in ways justified as therapeutic, even though similar contact outside the clinic would have been unthinkable. The procedures existed in a protected sphere, where the rules of ordinary conduct were suspended, replaced by the authority of those who claimed to heal. This suspension allowed acts that resembled domination more than medicine. Doctors maintained that their work was purely clinical, but their explanations often revealed how little they understood the emotional impact of their methods. They relied on terminology that sounded scientific: paroxysm, congestion, and nervous surplus, but they offered no coherent theory behind these words. What they did offer were procedures that placed women in positions of vulnerability, reinforcing a hierarchy in which the doctor's intentions mattered more than the patient's experience. The system treated women as bodies to be corrected, rather than individuals to be understood. This dynamic intensified as clinics became more popular. Once a treatment gained acceptance, no one felt compelled to examine its moral dimensions. The culture encouraged physicians to see themselves as protectors of societal order. If a woman behaved in ways that disturbed her family or embarrassed her community, the doctor's role was to contain her. Treatments, no matter how invasive, became tools for restoring harmony. The clinic claimed to calm the individual, while simultaneously appeasing the expectations of those around her. The confusion between care and control made it nearly impossible for patients to articulate what felt wrong. They lacked the vocabulary to describe violations disguised as therapy. Even when they sensed that something about the treatment was deeply unsettling, social expectation prevented them from speaking openly. Victorian morality demanded modesty, silence, and obedience from women, making the clinic a perfect environment for practices that thrived on those constraints. Everything was arranged to ensure that the doctor's judgment remained absolute. Inside the treatment room, this boundary slipped even further. The lighting was dim, the attendants quiet, the atmosphere controlled. Doctors instructed women to relax, to breathe slowly, to accept the sensations as part of the healing process. These instructions transformed the room into a space where compliance became ritual, a performance expected of every patient. The body responded naturally to touch, heat, and pressure, and the clinic claimed credit for those responses. Yet none of this addressed the emotional distress that had brought many women there in the first place. Looking back, it is difficult not to see the entire structure as a carefully engineered veil. The procedures were shaped to appear medical. The language was shaped to appear scientific. The intentions were shaped to appear moral. But beneath these layers lay a truth. Victorian society refused to confront. The treatments were built on power, not understanding. They offered control, not compassion. They protected authority, not dignity. The real question was never whether these procedures worked. It was whether they should have existed at all. At a time when women could be confined for expressing ordinary human emotions, the clinic became a place where medicine catered to social fears rather than genuine health. The treatments may have been described with gentle words, but their impact carved deep marks that lasted long after a woman left the building. Everything described here reveals how medical treatment drifted precariously close to violation when shaped by power instead of empathy. And as the procedures grew more elaborate, they opened pathways for tools and devices that carried the weight of science, but none of its safety. Inside those guarded rooms, instruments waited that promised precision while delivering consequences few women dared to name. Inside many Victorian women's clinics, the most unsettling objects were not the charts on the walls, the pamphlets promising relief, or even the rooms arranged to suppress resistance. It was the instruments, cold, mechanical, and unapologetically intrusive, that revealed the true nature of the treatments. These tools stood ready long before a patient entered their presence, shaping the atmosphere with a quiet authority more convincing than any spoken reassurance. They were designed for precision, or so the doctors claimed, yet their impact reached far beyond the physical. The early mechanical vibrators, for instance, were presented as remarkable inventions of modern medicine. Heavy, loud, and powered by hand cranks or bulky motors, they were intended to induce muscular release and reduce the congestion of nerves that doctors believed caused hysteria. Their size and weight alone made them intimidating. The vibrations produced were not gentle or measured, but forceful and unrefined, sending shocks through the body that few women anticipated. Doctors insisted these reactions were signs of improvement, though they rarely asked how the sensations actually felt. These machines occupied entire corners of treatment rooms. They were often mounted on stands or fixed to tables, surrounded by wires or belts that needed constant adjustment. Attendants, always female but always subordinate, prepared the devices, while the doctor explained nothing. The noise of the machinery filled the space, drowning out any thoughts a woman might try to hold on to. Once the device touched her skin, the rest became a blur of sensation, something she was expected to endure quietly. The metal instruments used for pelvic examinations carried a different kind of heaviness. They were crafted from steel or iron cold to the touch, even in heated rooms. They lacked refinement, resembling tools more suited to industrial workshops than medical practice. Their weight made them difficult to handle gently, and their rigidity left no room for the body's natural responses. Women were asked to remain still, while these instruments were inserted or adjusted, their discomfort dismissed as either necessary or imagined. Some instruments were designed to widen others, to probe others, to apply pressure in ways that doctors claimed were diagnostic. None of these procedures was explained with clarity. The doctor's confidence overshadowed the unfamiliarity of the tools themselves, leaving women to interpret the experience on their own. Many described feeling disconnected from their bodies, as though the procedures separated them from their own physical identity. The cold surface of the metal created an emotional distance as sharp as the physical intrusion. The instruments were kept on trays, covered with cloths, arranged in a way that suggested order rather than compassion. Doctors selected them with practiced ease, lifting each one as though it were merely an extension of their judgment. The women watching had little choice but to trust in that judgment. Victorian society conditioned them to believe that experts knew best, even when the experts offered no comfort. The tools therefore functioned as symbols of authority as much as implements of treatment. The emotional consequences of these instruments were often minimized. Clinics focused on visible outcomes, ignoring the fear that lingered long after a session ended. Some women experienced trembling that lasted for hours, not from illness but from shock. Others found it difficult to speak afterward, overwhelmed by the sense that something had been taken from them without acknowledgement. The absence of discussion surrounding these reactions only deepened the impact. Silence became part of the treatment, erasing any attempt to understand the experience. What makes these tools particularly haunting is how easily they were accepted. Doctors described them as efficient. Families saw them as proof of advanced care. Society viewed them as necessary to maintain order. The instruments themselves, however, revealed a truth that the polite language of the clinics tried to hide Victorian medicine, often valued control more than compassion. The design of the tools emphasized restraint rather than comfort, precision rather than understanding. Some of the machines required women to be strapped into position so that the motions remained steady. Others demanded stillness in ways that ignored the body's natural impulses. A patient who flinched might be corrected sharply, told to cooperate for the sake of her recovery. The tools made resistance visible. Every movement, every tremor, every shudder became part of the doctor's assessment. The power dynamic was carved not only into the clinic's routines, but into the very shapes and textures of the instruments. Looking back, it becomes difficult to separate the mechanical innovation from the psychological harm these tools inflicted. Their creators may have intended them as medical advancements, but their use was shaped entirely by the culture of the time, a culture that treated women's emotions as defects and their bodies as sites of correction. The instruments embodied that belief, transforming medical care into a ritual of submission. They became artifacts of a system more interested in enforceable calm than in genuine healing. These devices disappeared gradually as medical understanding evolved, but their legacy remains unsettling. They remind us that technology alone does not guarantee progress. It can just as easily reinforce existing inequalities, especially when wielded by those who hold unquestioned authority. Victorian clinics demonstrated how easily instruments can become tools of compliance rather than care, and how quickly society can normalize what should never have been accepted. Everything described here reveals how the tools of treatment carried a weight far heavier than their physical form. And as the clinics embraced these instruments, they created conditions that led naturally to even harsher methods of restraint. Beyond the rooms, where machines hummed and metal chilled the air, other practices emerged that pushed vulnerable women into even deeper isolation. Isolation was one of the most quietly devastating practices found inside Victorian clinics. A method framed as restorative, but experienced by many women as a form of controlled disappearance. Once a doctor decided a patient required rest, she could be moved into a small room at the end of a corridor, a room with thick curtains, dim lighting, and a bed positioned in a way that made the space feel more like containment than care. The door closed softly, attendants left without conversation, and the silence pressed against the patient with a weight she had not anticipated. The stated purpose of isolation was simple: remove stimulation, reduce emotional strain, and allow the nervous system to reset. Yet the execution revealed something far more severe. Days passed with minimal human interaction. Meals arrived without comment. Windows remained shuttered to prevent agitation from outside sights or sounds. For many women, the stillness became suffocating, erasing any sense of time or connection. The environment did not soothe them, it hollowed them out. The extended sleep therapy paired with isolation intensified this effect. Doctors prescribed strong sedatives, sometimes natural extracts, sometimes early chemical compounds, and instructed attendants to administer them regularly. The goal was to keep the patient drifting in and out of consciousness long enough to dull emotional volatility. They called this a therapeutic pause, a chance for the mind to rest while the body remained undisturbed. In practice, it resembled a deliberate numbing of the self, a suspension of thought dressed in medical authority. A woman under this regimen often awoke disoriented. Her limbs felt heavy, her senses dulled, and her memory blurred. The sedatives created long pockets of emptiness, stretches of time where she remembered nothing except the impression of sinking deeper into the mattress. When she tried to speak, her voice felt distant. When she tried to stand, the ground moved beneath her. These effects were not accidental. They were considered signs that the therapy was working, proof that the overstimulated nerves were finally quiet. The clinic treated such silence as victory. A woman who slept through meals or failed to respond quickly was said to be stabilizing. No one asked whether she felt herself slipping away. No one considered that the dullness consuming her might be a symptom of the treatment rather than the illness. The focus remained on outcomes that made the clinic's routines easier. Fewer outbursts, fewer questions, fewer reminders that the patient was a person with thoughts and fears that deserved acknowledgement. The lack of human presence within isolation rooms also changed how women understood themselves. Without conversation or physical activity, the boundaries of the mind became porous. Some women reported hearing their own breathing as though it belonged to someone else. Others described moments of panic when they could not recall how long they had been there or why the therapy was necessary. But none of these reactions shaped the doctor's approach. The clinic saw only what aligned with its goals. Families were rarely allowed inside these rooms. They received updates from doctors who assured them that their loved one was resting comfortably. The truth, the disorientation, the loneliness, the drug-induced haze remained hidden behind gentle phrases like restorative regimen and temporary quietude. These reassurances made it easy for relatives to believe the treatment was humane. They could picture their family member reclining peacefully, unaware that the experience felt closer to abandonment. The attendants assigned to these rooms often walked on eggshells. They entered quietly, adjusted blankets, administered sedatives, and left again. Their instructions emphasized efficiency rather than empathy. They were told not to engage in conversation that might stimulate emotion, not to linger, not to offer comfort. Many complied out of fear of losing their positions. Some felt uneasy but followed orders anyway. The system rewarded silence at every layer. Over time, the therapy blurred the patient's sense of identity. Long periods of unconsciousness disrupted her awareness of who she was outside the clinic. She forgot routine habits, familiar details, even aspects of her personality that once grounded her. The treatment claimed to restore balance, yet it stripped away the very traits that made her distinct. When she finally emerged from isolation, she often felt like a visitor inside her own thoughts. This erasure served the clinic's purpose. A woman who struggled to gather her thoughts or articulate her feelings was easier to guide. She became dependent on the doctor's interpretations of her condition, unable to challenge decisions made for her. The sedation softened any potential resistance, shaping a patient who appeared calm, not because she had healed, but because the therapy had hollowed out her emotional landscape. Sleep therapy also masked the consequences of other treatments. Women recovering from mechanical devices or invasive examinations were sometimes placed into isolation immediately afterward, giving the appearance of peaceful recovery while concealing distress. The sedatives suppressed physical tremors and emotional reactions, preventing patients from expressing trauma that might have exposed the brutality of earlier procedures. In this sense, sleep therapy functioned as both treatment and cover. The most haunting part of these rooms was the stillness. Without footsteps, conversation, or daylight, even the faintest noises became reminders of isolation. A drip of water in a wash basin, the scrape of a tray being placed on the floor, the whisper of fabric as an attendant adjusted a curtain. Each sound reinforced the same message: the woman inside had no say in her care. She was meant to rest, to sleep, to surrender. Looking back, it becomes clear that these treatments were less about healing and more about simplifying the management of patients who did not fit the mold of acceptable femininity. Isolation solved the problem of emotional expression by removing the woman from view. Sleep therapy eliminated the possibility of protest by drowning her awareness. The rhetoric of nervous restoration concealed a practice rooted in erasure. Everything described here reveals how isolation disguised itself as care, while quietly dismantling a woman's sense of self. And as these silent rooms multiplied inside Victorian clinics, they laid the groundwork for harsher interventions that targeted not only behavior, but the spirit itself. From deeper within those controlled halls, another method waited, one that relied not on solitude but on shock. Among the treatments Victorian clinics adopted to calm women diagnosed with hysteria, shock therapy carried an especially stark logic. It relied on the idea that the body could be forced into submission through sudden, jarring sensations, cold that seized the lungs or electric jolts that stiffened the muscles before the mind had time to react. Doctors rarely questioned the ethics of these methods. They saw the patients flinch, tremble, or collapse, not as signs of distress, but as proof that the nervous system was responding as intended. Electric shock began as a minor jolt delivered through handheld coils or small battery devices placed against the skin. The current was weak by modern standards, but for women unprepared for the experience, the effect was enough to create fear. The body reacted instantly. Shoulders tightened, breath shortened, hands recoiled. These reactions were interpreted as signs that the system was being reset. The doctor's confidence in this interpretation left no room to consider that the woman's response might be rooted in alarm rather than therapeutic release. Some clinics preferred cold water shock, which they considered more natural. The treatment rarely involved gentle cooling. Instead, women were submerged quickly into basins of icy water or had buckets of cold water poured over their bodies, forcing a gasp or involuntary cry. The sudden temperature change overwhelmed the senses, leaving the patient shaking uncontrollably. Attendants lifted her out, wrapped her in coarse linens, and waited for the trembling to subside. Doctors insisted the shock cleared the mind, as though clarity could emerge from a moment of panic. The procedures had a common goal: to break emotional resistance. A woman who entered a session with anger, anxiety, or confusion often left disoriented, weakened, or too exhausted to argue. Doctors viewed this shift as an improvement. Families hearing the reassurances believed the treatment restored calm. But for the woman who endured it, the sudden violence of cold or electricity left a lingering sensation of vulnerability, an awareness that her body could be manipulated without warning. Shock therapy became a preferred method for women who resisted other treatments. If a patient hesitated during an examination or questioned a doctor's decision, she might be sent to the cold room or subjected to electrical stimulation. The connection between resistance and punishment was never stated openly, but women understood it intuitively. The threat of shock hovered over the clinic, shaping behavior more effectively than any verbal instruction. Over time, many learned to remain quiet to avoid drawing attention, to move carefully between one treatment and the next. Doctors framed shock as a practical solution. They believed emotional intensity needed to be halted abruptly, and nothing halted emotion more effectively than fear. By imposing an experience the patient could not control, they created compliance, disguised as a therapeutic breakthrough. The logic was simple. Obedience was treated as stability, and stability was treated as health. Under this framework, even the absence of protest became a diagnostic achievement. These treatments were carried out in plain rooms, with tiled floors, metal basins, and windows often blocked to prevent distraction. The walls echoed with the sound of water being poured, metal scraping, or the faint crackle of electrical devices. Women accustomed to the quiet gloom of isolation found shock therapy brutally vivid, a sudden intrusion of sensation after long hours of muffled silence. The contrast made the experience even more jarring. Attendants played a significant role, though they had little authority. They held patients in place, adjusted the devices, and followed the doctor's commands without hesitation. Their presence added another layer of imbalance. Women were surrounded by hands that guided, lifted, restrained, or wiped away water, yet none of those hands offered reassurance. The attendants were trained to observe, not comfort. Any attempt at empathy risked being labeled unprofessional. Many women left these sessions visibly shaken. Some experienced muscle spasms for hours, others developed fevers or dizziness, but unless the symptoms interfered with the schedule, they were ignored. The clinic interpreted physical exhaustion as therapeutic success. A patient too tired to express distress was considered calm. A patient too disoriented to speak clearly was labeled improved. The metrics favored silence, not well-being. The emotional impact persisted in ways the clinic refused to acknowledge. Women learned to brace themselves whenever footsteps approached. They developed a heightened awareness of cold drafts, damp fabric, or the faint scent of electrical insulation. These details became warnings that another session might be coming. Some described feeling their breath constrict even before the treatment began, a reflex the clinic misinterpreted as further hysteria. Shock therapy also affected how women saw themselves. The treatment suggested that their bodies were unpredictable machines, needing abrupt correction to function properly. This reinforced the belief that their emotions were dangerous, something to be controlled rather than understood. Over time, many internalized this message, accepting the idea that their reactions were inherently flawed. The clinic's authority depended on this belief and encouraged it at every turn. Looking back, the harshness of these methods feels unmistakable. Yet, within the Victorian medical system, shock therapy appeared logical, even progressive. It fit into a worldview that valued restraint, order, and emotional suppression. Women who had once expressed ordinary human frustration were taught to fear the consequences of speaking too loudly or feeling too deeply. The jolt of electricity or the sting of ice became symbols of a broader truth. The system did not aim to heal them, only to discipline them. Everything described here reveals how shock treatments blurred the boundary between medicine and punishment. And as clinics grew accustomed to such methods, they created an environment where women's reactions mattered less than the obedience they produced. Along the quieter edges of institutional care, another pathway formed, one that sent many women not home but deeper into confinement. In Victorian society, the line between a clinic and an asylum was thin enough to vanish with a single signature. Women who entered a clinic for treatment could without warning find themselves transported to a distant institution with iron gates, stone walls, and corridors designed not for healing but for containment. The shift happened quietly. A doctor's report, a concerned family member, or a moment of resistance during treatment could be interpreted as proof that a woman required permanent care. Once the decision was made, the process unfolded with a kind of grim efficiency. Transport to an asylum was rarely dramatic. A carriage arrived early in the morning, attendants escorted the woman inside, and the door shut before she could ask the questions forming in her mind. There was no trial, no chance to explain herself. The justification sounded clinical, a need for further observation, a concern for her safety. But the reality was far more stark. Many women were removed not because they were dangerous, but because their presence unsettled the structures around them. They had questioned a treatment, cried too loudly, refused compliance, or simply behaved in ways that challenged expectations of quiet femininity. Asylums operated on a logic of permanence. Clinics promised temporary interventions, but asylums offered no such reassurance. Upon arrival, women were assigned to rooms that echoed with the weight of years rather than hours. The beds were narrow, the windows barred, the walls thick enough to swallow the smallest sounds. Attendants watched constantly, taking note of expressions, movements, and tone of voice. Anything could be misinterpreted: fatigue, frustration, or fear. Each reaction became another entry in a growing file that justified her presence there. Inside these institutions, individuality dissolved quickly. Clothing was standardized. Routines were strict. Meals arrived at precise hours. Women ate, walked, sat, and slept according to rules that tolerated no deviation. The loss of autonomy, subtle at first, deepened as days became weeks. A woman who once resisted might slowly stop asking questions. A woman who once pleaded for release might stop speaking altogether. Silence became a survival strategy, though it often served as further evidence that she belonged there. The attitudes of staff shaped much of the experience. Doctors visited occasionally, walking through the wards with notebooks in hand, observing behavior as though studying a distant species. Their conversations centered on symptoms, not people. Nurses reinforced orders with soft but firm commands, their tasks guided more by discipline than compassion. Over time, the institution taught women that their discomfort, despair, or confusion were irrelevant compared to the smooth functioning of the asylum. One of the most disturbing aspects was how easily women entered these places, compared to how difficult it was to leave. Families who lost patients, husbands eager to remove inconvenience, or doctors seeking tidy resolutions, found the asylum an appealing option. Once admitted, a woman's chances of release depended entirely on the judgments of the very system that had misunderstood her in the first place. Protests were taken as instability. Expressions of anger were labelled as mania. Longing for freedom was described as agitation. The asylum created its own logic, and within that logic, escape became nearly impossible. Even the physical environment contributed to the sense of erasure. Long hallways, amplified footsteps, but deadened voices. Common rooms were filled with women who had lived there for decades, their faces marked by resignation. Some paced, some rocked in their chairs, some stared into spaces that seemed to exist only in their memories. New arrivals quickly understood that time did not move the same way inside these walls. Days blended into one another, stripped of meaning, except for the routine that defined each hour. Isolation also persisted in subtler ways. Letters were censored or never delivered. Visits from family were infrequent or discouraged. Administrators justified this as necessary for rest, though many women recognized it as a deliberate severing of ties. Cut off from outside voices, they were left alone with the institution's narrative, one that framed their confinement as a medical necessity rather than a social convenience. For those who attempted to describe their experience, language often failed. How could they explain that they were not ill, only misplaced? How could they convince others that their frustration was rational, their sadness understandable? In a society that equated conformity with sanity, deviation itself became a diagnosis. The asylum did not correct this logic, it reinforced it. Every protest became proof of instability. Every withdrawal became proof of weakness. Every effort to reclaim identity became evidence of the very condition used to justify confinement. Looking back, the tragedy lies not only in the physical confinement, but in the quiet acceptance that allowed it to continue. Families overwhelmed by social expectations believed they were acting responsibly. Doctors claimed authority they never fully understood. Communities considered institutionalization a necessary response to behavior that challenged their norms. And the women inside, those whose lives were reshaped by a system more focused on order than understanding, could only endure the consequences of decisions made without their consent. The asylums stood as monuments to a broader truth. Victorian society feared emotion independence and unpredictability in women, and it built structures to contain those fears. A woman who dared to step outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior could lose not just her freedom, but her future, her identity, and her voice. The walls around her were made of stone, but the logic behind them was constructed long before the buildings existed. Everything described here reveals how confinement functioned less as treatment and more as a method of quiet removal. And as the doors of these asylums closed behind countless women, they marked the point where medicine surrendered entirely to social control. From another branch of this same system, judgment shifted into the homes of the privileged, where morality itself became a silent instrument of restraint. Once a woman received the diagnosis of hysteria, the label settled on her life with a weight that shaped everything that followed. The term itself functioned less as a description of symptoms and more as a judgment of character, a way of turning ordinary expressions of emotion into markers of instability. From that moment onward, every gesture she made, every sigh, every hesitation, every flicker of frustration became evidence used to justify the diagnosis. The label did not simply define her, it confined her. Doctors treated the diagnosis as a lens through which they interpreted all behavior. A woman who cried was proving emotional disorder. A woman who stayed silent was demonstrating withdrawal. A woman who asked questions revealed agitation. The system allowed no neutral actions. Everything reinforced the doctor's authority. Because hysteria lacked clear criteria, it absorbed whatever interpretation suited the moment, expanding to cover any deviation from expected femininity. Families also became captives of the diagnosis. Once they accepted the word hysteria, they began to reinterpret past events through its filter. Moments of irritation, periods of sadness, or expressions of independence took on new meaning. Relatives repeated the doctor's reasoning, reinforcing the belief that the woman's emotions were dangerous and needed to be controlled. Even when the woman tried to explain herself, her explanations were dismissed as symptoms. Her voice lost its credibility the moment the label entered the conversation. The most damaging part of the diagnosis was its permanence. Clinics did not offer clear timelines for recovery. There were no criteria for declaring a woman healthy again. The absence of these guidelines created a system in which the diagnosis could follow her indefinitely, resurfacing whenever she behaved in ways others found unsettling. She might leave a clinic, but the label traveled with her, ready to be invoked by a doctor, a husband, a parent, or anyone who found her emotions inconvenient. Women learned quickly how precarious their position had become. They knew that disagreement could be reinterpreted as agitation. They understood that fatigue could be mistaken for melancholy, and melancholy for decline. Many began suppressing their reactions, choosing caution over honesty. This self-silencing created a double burden. They carried the weight of their emotions privately, while performing composure publicly. Even then, the fear of being misunderstood haunted daily life. Inside clinics, the diagnosis determined the trajectory of treatment. A woman labeled hysterical had no authority to refuse procedures, no right to question methods. Any resistance reinforced the diagnosis, strengthening the doctor's argument that she required further intervention. This circular system made it impossible for her to defend herself. Even her attempts to express discomfort became part of the evidence against her. Outside the clinic, the diagnosis shaped social identity. Neighbors whispered. Acquaintances made assumptions. A woman once respected could find herself regarded with suspicion or pity. Her credibility diminished, her opportunities narrowed, her autonomy eroded. The label attached itself to her reputation, creating boundaries that others felt entitled to enforce. A society already steeped in rigid expectations of femininity used hysteria as a tool to discipline those who did not conform. What made the diagnosis most suffocating was its ability to override reality. Even when a woman suffered from grief, exhaustion, or pressure, the kinds of emotional strain common to everyone, she was denied the right to experience them as human experiences. Instead, they became symptoms of illness. The very act of feeling deeply became something to correct. In this landscape, a woman's emotions were stripped of meaning, reduced to signs of disorder that justified intervention. The diagnosis also served as a shield for those who wished to avoid accountability. Husbands frustrated by their wives' dissatisfaction found the label convenient. Parents overwhelmed by daughters who questioned authority used it to silence them. Doctors relied on it to maintain professional control. Within this network of convenience, the woman's needs disappeared entirely. What mattered was restoring order, not understanding her perspective. Many women found themselves trapped in a cycle where attempts to reclaim autonomy only strengthened the system's hold. If they insisted they were healthy, they were accused of denial. If they protested mistreatment, they were accused of mania. If they attempted to escape a clinic or asylum, their panic was used as proof of instability. The diagnosis created a version of reality where the woman always lost. It was a structure built to absorb resistance and convert it into further justification. Over time, the effects seeped into self-perception. Some women began doubting their own emotions. They questioned whether their reactions were reasonable or signs of the disorder others insisted they had. This internal conflict eroded confidence and created an emotional fog that could last for years. The diagnosis, once imposed from outside, eventually shaped the inner life of the woman herself. Looking back, hysteria functioned as a tool of control disguised as medical insight. It flourished not because it explained illness, but because it preserved social order. It disciplined women into silence, conformity, and dependence. The diagnosis served those who wielded it, not those who bore its consequences. And once imposed, it became nearly impossible to escape, no matter how unjust its origins. Everything described here reveals how the diagnosis operated as a cage that tightened each time a woman tried to speak. And as this cage became accepted across households and clinics alike, it opened the way for treatments that blurred even further the lines between morality and medicine. Out of this widening structure of control, another force emerged, one driven not by fear of illness, but by fear of desire itself. Within Victorian clinics, the boundary between medical procedure and personal violation could dissolve with alarming ease. Nowhere was this collapse more visible than in the hands of doctors who exploited the ambiguity of treatment for their own gratification. The methods they employed had already blurred the line between healing and control. It was a short step further for some to reinterpret therapeutic touch as an opportunity to satisfy desires that society denied them elsewhere. The environment, built on silence and unquestioned authority, created conditions where such acts could occur without challenge. Pelvic massage, already an invasive procedure, offered a convenient veneer of legitimacy. A doctor could position himself close to a patient, instruct her to relax and engage in intimate contact that would have been scandalous in any other setting. The woman's body reacted instinctively, and the clinic interpreted these reactions as symptoms resolving. The doctor, shielded by medical language, could continue undisturbed. The patient, trapped between confusion and obedience, rarely grasped how thoroughly her vulnerability was being exploited. Victorian society made this dynamic possible by conditioning women to avoid speaking about their bodies, pleasure, or discomfort. Terms like modesty and virtue were invoked constantly, shaping behavior long before a woman ever entered a treatment room. When a doctor touched her in ways she could not describe publicly, the shame belonged to her, not to him. This cultural silence became the perfect cover. The clinic functioned as a space where prohibited acts acquired a false legitimacy, and the people harmed by them lacked the vocabulary to object. The power imbalance intensified every aspect of the experience. Doctors held control over diagnoses, treatments, and interpretations of behavior. If a woman reacted with tension, he labeled it nervous agitation. If she froze, he claimed it was hypersensitivity. If she expressed discomfort, he recorded the reaction as instability, requiring further sessions. The system transformed any response into justification. Under such conditions, a doctor who wished to cross the line found nothing standing in his way. Not the institution, not the law, not even social scrutiny. Some attendants witnessed behaviors they could not explain but avoided confrontation. Their employment depended on silence. They were instructed to follow the doctor's lead, not question it. Even when they sensed that a treatment had slipped into something else, they lacked the authority to intervene. The clinic's hierarchy protected the doctor at every level. A complaint, even if voiced, risked being dismissed as misunderstanding or hysteria on the part of the observer. For the women subjected to such abuse, the experience was disorienting. They entered the clinic expecting treatment for emotional distress, only to be met with sensations that confused or frightened them. Because the procedures themselves were intimate by design, distinguishing medical intent from personal violation became impossible. Some women described feeling as though they were drifting in a fog, aware that something felt wrong but unable to articulate why. Sedatives, exhaustion, and the emotional weight of the hysteria diagnosis further muddled their perceptions. The societal narrative reinforced their silence. Victorian culture insisted that women maintain composure, avoid confrontation, and preserve the appearance of propriety, even at personal cost. A woman who accused a doctor risked being dismissed as unstable or immoral, and the stigma of such accusations could stain her reputation permanently. Many weighed the consequences and concluded that silence was safer. Their suffering remained invisible, hidden behind polite facades and medical terminology. Legal protections were minimal. The law did not recognize many forms of abuse that occurred in clinical settings, particularly when couched in medical language. Consent in the modern sense did not exist. A doctor's authority was considered absolute unless his behavior violated property rights or public order. Private misconduct within clinic walls rarely reached a courtroom. Women who tried to seek justice faced insurmountable barriers, skepticism, humiliation, and institutional denial. What is most troubling is how these acts became normalized. The ambiguity of treatment blurred distinctions that should have remained inviolable. Once clinics accepted intimate contact as therapeutic, unethical behavior could hide in the shadows cast by those same justifications. Doctors who exploited their patients did not need cunning. They needed only the shelter of a system designed to protect them at every turn. The women, meanwhile, carried the consequences alone, their sense of bodily ownership eroded by experiences framed as essential care. The emotional aftermath was often profound. Some women avoided discussing the treatment altogether, burying memories that felt too confusing or shameful to revisit. Others internalized the idea that their discomfort was proof of the disorder they had been accused of. A few withdrew from intimacy in their personal lives, associating physical closeness with manipulation and fear. The clinic labeled these reactions signs of improvement or further hysteria, never recognizing them as trauma born of violation. Looking back, it becomes clear that these abuses were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a larger structure. A system built on unquestioned authority, moral silence, and rigid gender expectations made exploitation almost inevitable. Victorian medicine presented itself as rational and progressive, yet its practices revealed a deep unease with female autonomy. The treatment room became a stage where domination could masquerade as a cure, and women learned that their discomfort carried no weight in the balance of power. The legacy of these violations lingers uneasily in the historical record. They remind us how easily a society can mistake control for care, how quickly moral certainty can justify harm, and how thoroughly silence can protect those who exploit it. The clinics claim to heal, but the experiences of many women tell a different story, one in which treatment became indistinguishable from coercion. Everything described here reveals how medical authority could twist intimacy into a tool of dominance. And as these blurred boundaries hardened into routine, they shaped responses that punished resistance rather than understanding distress. At the margins of this evolving system, those who tried to push back discovered consequences that echoed far beyond the treatment room. Inside Victorian clinics, refusal was treated not as a choice but as a symptom. The system operated on the assumption that a woman lacked the authority to make decisions about her own body, so any attempt to decline treatment was interpreted as proof that she needed it even more. A patient who expressed hesitation or discomfort was usually met with a calm but firm insistence that resistance indicated worsening instability. Her voice, already diminished by the hysterical diagnosis, was overwritten before she even finished speaking. When a woman attempted to refuse further procedures, isolation became the clinic's first response. She might be led to a narrow room at the end of a quiet hallway, told to rest and left behind a locked door. No explanation, no timeline, just silence. The walls were often bare, the mattress thin, the air heavy, with the stillness that settled when staff walked away. Isolation was framed as a cooling measure, a necessary pause to restore emotional balance. Yet it quickly revealed itself as punishment designed to break a patient's will. Time blurred inside those rooms, allowing fear and confusion to fill the gaps left by absent voices. If isolation did not create compliance, sedation was introduced. A doctor or nurse would arrive with a polite instruction to lie down, followed by an injection or a spoonful of bitter liquid. The sedative slowed, thought softened resistance, and muddled judgment. A woman drifting in and out of consciousness could not protest, could not understand, and could not remember clearly. Staff described this as therapeutic rest, but it dulled more than distress. It dulled autonomy. The patient awoke unsure whether hours or days had passed, her sense of time fractured by forced stillness. Victorian medicine often labelled defiance as dangerous. A woman who raised her voice, resisted touch, or questioned treatment was said to be agitated, unmanageable, or a threat to herself. These labels justified escalating measures. The patient who resisted too strongly might be transferred to a larger institution where compliance was enforced through rigid routines and constant supervision. Her refusal, once a simple expression of discomfort, now served as evidence of severe instability. Families rarely challenged these decisions. Many accepted the doctor's explanation that their relative needed more intensive care. Letters from the patient were often intercepted or discouraged. Some women wrote anyway, leaving small notes hidden under bedding or between floorboards, each one a quiet attempt to assert that they were still thinking clearly. The notes rarely reached anyone. Staff considered them signs of obsession or confusion, further reinforcing the belief that separation from the outside world was justified. Inside these institutions, the consequences of resistance deepened. Rules controlled nearly every aspect of life. Waking, eating, resting, and speaking were regulated by staff members who enforced order with the same confidence they applied to medical procedures. A woman who refused medication might be restrained for her safety. A woman who questioned authority could be confined to a smaller room. A woman who tried to leave could be declared too unstable to participate in daily routines. Everything she did fed the system's logic, creating a loop where attempts to reclaim agency resulted only in more severe restrictions. The emotional toll was immense. Women who once expressed themselves clearly found their voices gradually fading under the weight of constant supervision. They learned that speaking too loudly drew punishment, while silence kept them out of trouble. Many withdrew inward, conserving energy and emotion in ways that staff interpreted as improvement. In reality, these quiet behaviors were symptoms of resignation, a recognition that resistance carried a cost they could no longer bear. Doctors documented compliance as progress. A patient who stopped objecting was labelled more cooperative. A patient who no longer questioned procedures was considered calmer. These observations appeared in medical records that shaped decisions about continued treatment. The reports rarely acknowledged the underlying truth. Compliance often grew out of exhaustion, not recovery. The clinic mistook defeat for stability. Punishment extended beyond the walls of medical institutions. A woman who had once been confined or sedated carried the stigma with her long after release. Neighbors whispered about her instability. Family members treated her delicately as though she might fracture without warning. Prospects for employment, marriage, or social participation diminished. A diagnosis intended to control short-term behavior often ended up reshaping the entire direction of a woman's life. The threat of confinement influenced women who had never entered a clinic. Many learned to suppress emotions, fears, and frustrations to avoid attracting attention. They knew that being labelled hysterical could lead to forced treatments, and awareness of that risk shaped behaviour in subtle yet powerful ways. A society that treated female resistance as a medical illness fostered quiet compliance at home, in marriage, and in public life. Within clinic walls, the stories of women who resisted reveal how deeply punishment structured the system. Isolation, sedation, and transfer were not isolated responses. They were embedded practices that reinforced a hierarchy where female voices had little value. The doctors believed they were restoring order, yet their actions produced cycles of fear and passivity that extended far beyond the treatment room. The system's cruelty becomes clearer when examining the language used to justify it. Terms like safety, stability, and calm masked the reality of coercion. The clinics insisted that these measures protected women, even when those same women pleaded for autonomy or simply asked to leave. Society accepted these explanations, trusting medical authority without questioning its motivations. As a result, women were punished not for illness, but for asserting control over their own bodies. Some women never saw freedom again. Their initial act of resistance sealed their fate. They lived out the remainder of their lives inside institutions that treated their emotions as pathology and their voices as evidence of disorder. These stories linger as reminders of how fragile personal autonomy becomes when authority is allowed to decide who is rational and who is not. Everything described here makes clear how punishment was used not to cure, but to silence any woman who dared resist. And as these measures hardened into routine practice, they prepared the ground for a more refined form of control built on appearance and social duty rather than force. Out of that quiet pressure, another world emerged, one where morality became a tool sharper than any restraint. Victorian society often described its noble households as refined, orderly, and morally pure. Yet behind those polished rooms was a quiet fear that shaped the lives of women more tightly than any clinic. The expectation placed on noble women was simple on the surface: maintain grace, composure, and silence. But the meaning of those words ran deeper. A noble woman could not cry without being questioned. She could not raise her voice without being labeled unstable. Even a brief moment of frustration could become a matter of family concern. In a world built on appearances, the slightest crack in a woman's demeanor was treated like a stain spreading across the reputation of an entire household. Servants watched, relatives commented, and every gesture was quietly judged. A noble woman waking up tired after a restless night could be whispered about during breakfast. If she withdrew from a conversation, observers assumed an emotional problem. If her eyes glistened after hearing troubling news, the room often shifted as though something shameful had occurred. To others, these moments were signs that a woman might be slipping toward hysteria. The idea took hold easily because noble families depended on social approval, and any deviation felt dangerous. When a noble woman displayed visible sadness, the response rarely involved sympathy. Instead, her relatives discussed her composure. Her husband questioned whether she was managing her responsibilities. Her parents wondered if marriage had exposed a weakness. Doctors were summoned, not to understand but to correct. A woman's interior life had little room to exist. She was expected to present a calm exterior even when her thoughts trembled beneath it. This expectation made the boundary between normal emotion and supposed illness nearly impossible to define. In many households, a noble woman did not need to do anything dramatic to be sent for treatment. A brief argument with a sibling, a moment of raised tension with her husband, or a simple outburst of frustration could be considered evidence of instability. Families spoke of such decisions as necessary. They said it was for her well-being, for her nerves, for the balance of the home. But beneath those phrases was a fear of scandal, and the fear mattered more than the woman herself. Some families treated medical intervention as a precaution, something to ensure that no emotional disruption spoiled their social standing. A noble woman who cried too often was viewed as a risk. A woman who questioned her husband's decisions was considered defiant. A woman who withdrew into silence was labeled fragile. Each of these states could be interpreted as hysteria, depending on who observed her and what they wished to protect. These interpretations shaped the rules of her daily life. She learned not to raise her voice, not to express sorrow, not to show disappointment. She learned to keep her emotions contained until they became nearly invisible. Inside many homes, conversations about treatment did not include the woman concerned. Decisions were made in separate rooms during quiet discussions between fathers, husbands, and doctors. They spoke of symptoms she did not know she had, and treatments she did not ask for. Once a decision was made, she was told only that it was necessary, and the tone of those around her left little room to disagree. Any sign of hesitation strengthened their belief that something was wrong. In this way, noble women found themselves caught in a system where resistance was proof of illness and compliance was expected proof of recovery. Even when no clinic was involved, the pressure inside the household functioned as its own form of restraint. A noble woman often adjusted her behavior to avoid suspicion. She practiced stillness in public rooms. She moderated her voice during meals. She swallowed her frustration during conversations. Many learned to cry only behind locked doors, controlling the sound so no one overheard. The entire structure of noble respectability depended on women presenting an image that aligned with expectations crafted by others. The fear of damaging the family's name was used as justification for everything. Husbands insisted that treatment would preserve order. Parents insisted that intervention would prevent embarrassment. Doctors insisted that early correction was better than waiting for worse signs. Through these arguments, the woman's own understanding of her feelings became irrelevant. What mattered was whether her behavior threatened the household's appearance of stability. For noble women, Hysteria became not a diagnosis, but a tool, something invoked to keep them within narrow boundaries. The more pressure placed upon them, the more any reaction could be interpreted as instability. Tears could mean weakness. Anger could mean defiance. Fatigue could mean imbalance. A woman did not need to be unwell to be treated as though she were. She simply needed to be noticeable. And so many noble women moved through their days aware that their own bodies and emotions were monitored. They understood that stepping outside the expectations of composure could lead to intervention. They understood that their reputation and their family's reputation were intertwined. They understood that silence was safer than honesty. This awareness lingered like a shadow across their interactions, shaping every choice they made. Everything described here shows how noble expectations transformed ordinary emotion into something dangerous the moment it disrupted the polished surface of respectability. And as these pressures tightened the lives of upper-class women, they pushed the conversation around hysteria into a deeper and more forbidden territory. Through these restrained corridors emerged a subject many refused to name: the uneasy fear surrounding women's desire and the urge to suppress it. Clinics of the period often presented themselves as places devoted to order and medical expertise. Yet beneath that appearance lay an unspoken subject that shaped nearly every diagnosis of hysteria. Female sexuality, when expressed openly or even privately, was viewed not as a natural part of life but as a threat. A woman's desire was treated as a force that needed to be controlled, contained, or erased. The medical language of the time adopted this belief without hesitation. Doctors wrote about excessive feeling, unmanaged sensuality, and nervous agitation, all phrases used to describe ordinary human impulses. In their hands, desire became a symptom, and the woman experiencing it became a patient. Inside many households, the same attitude prevailed. Women were expected to suppress any sign of physical longing. A married woman who expressed interest in intimacy could be considered improper, while an unmarried woman who showed curiosity about her own body risked being labeled disturbed. Privacy did little to protect them. Even behaviors that took place quietly behind closed doors were condemned when discovered. The idea that a woman might explore her own pleasure was considered dangerous, a step toward instability, and something that threatened the moral foundation of the home. Doctors reinforced these beliefs by insisting that female sexuality had to be monitored. Publications of the time spoke of dangerous stimulation and the need to protect women from their own impulses. In practice, this meant teaching women to avoid touching their own bodies, avoiding conversations about pleasure, and steering away from anything that might awaken desire. Mothers repeated these ideas to daughters, teachers repeated them to girls in school, and husbands repeated them to wives. The message remained consistent: control yourself or others will control you. When a woman displayed signs of frustration, sadness, or restlessness, physicians often interpreted these feelings as evidence of sexual imbalance. They described such women as suffering from agitation of the nerves or congestion of the uterus, terms that conveniently framed emotions as physical disorders. Many women labeled with hysteria were simply struggling with the weight of denial. They were told to ignore their own needs, to pretend their bodies felt nothing, and to hide every instinct that conflicted with societal pressure. The more they attempted to suppress these feelings, the more they appeared tense, fatigued, or withdrawn, symptoms doctors readily seized upon. Because open discussion of sexuality was forbidden, women had no vocabulary to explain their experiences. A woman who felt longing had no acceptable way to describe it. A woman who felt confused by her own desires had no one to consult. A woman who felt discomfort or distress related to intimacy often suffered in silence. As a result, doctors interpreted silence as passivity and misunderstanding as illness. Entire areas of a woman's emotional life were forced into shadows, where they were observed only through the lens of suspicion. Some treatments for hysteria emerged precisely because doctors sought to manage female sexuality without acknowledging what they were doing. When physicians recommended pelvic massage, they justified it as a method for releasing nervous tension. They avoided discussing the pleasure it produced and insisted that the result, temporary relaxation, proved its necessity. When mechanical devices were introduced to make the process faster and less strenuous for doctors, they were marketed as innovations in women's health. The underlying reality remained unspoken. These treatments addressed desire while pretending desire did not exist. Women undergoing such procedures often felt confused or ashamed. They were told that the sensation they experienced was medical, not emotional. They learned that their bodies could react strongly, while their minds were expected to remain detached. This disconnection created a space in which misunderstanding grew. Some women believed they were ill because their reactions were intense. Others believed they were unnatural because they experienced pleasure in contexts framed as treatment. Few had the chance to understand their bodies on their own terms. In many communities, even married women were discouraged from acknowledging desire. The expectation was modesty, restraint, and obedience. Husbands made decisions about intimacy, and wives were instructed to comply without expressing emotion. If a woman showed reluctance, she risked being judged unstable. If she showed enthusiasm, she risked being considered indecent. The narrow path between these extremes left many women without a sense of agency. Their sexuality existed only as something to be regulated by others. Doctors used the term hysteria to gather these concerns under a single label. They rarely asked women what they felt. Instead, they inferred symptoms based on behavior. A woman pacing her room late at night might be described as restless due to emotional disturbance. A woman who avoids conversation might be labeled withdrawn due to inner conflict. A woman with a lively temperament might be told she suffered from overstimulation. These interpretations ignored the pressures placed upon women and framed their natural responses as signs of disorder. Because society refused to acknowledge female desire, it also refused to recognize the harm of suppressing it. Many women suffered anxiety, exhaustion, or emotional numbness. Yet instead of understanding these conditions, doctors prescribed treatments that reinforced control. Some women accepted these methods because they saw no alternative. Others complied because resistance threatened their reputation. Still, others surrendered because they lacked the support needed to challenge the authority of husbands, parents, or physicians. The connection between hysteria and sexuality was rarely stated directly, but it shaped nearly every aspect of diagnosis. It allowed doctors to enforce moral expectations while presenting their actions as medical care. It enabled families to maintain strict appearances by framing their daughters or wives as patients instead of individuals with legitimate emotional needs. It gave society a way to regulate women without confronting its own discomfort with desire. Everything described here shows how hysteria functioned as a quiet mechanism to deny women ownership of their own bodies and emotions. And as these beliefs spread through every level of society, they prepared the ground for clinics that hid cruelty behind polished walls. Across those controlled rooms waited a form of respectability that masked something far more disturbing, an institution built to control through appearances rather than truth. Many clinics of the time were designed to present an image of calm order the moment someone stepped inside. The floors were polished, the walls were pale, and the air felt controlled in a way that suggested safety. Doctors wore neat coats, moved with measured steps, and spoke in tones that implied authority. To an observer walking past the entrance, the building appeared no different from respectable medical facilities meant to relieve illness and restore health. But once the door closed behind a woman entering for treatment, the atmosphere changed. Behind the careful arrangement of brightness and silence was a system that relied on control rather than care. Women who arrived for therapy were often greeted with a routine that felt more like intake than welcome. They were asked to sit in plain waiting rooms with no distractions. Nurses, usually acting under strict guidelines, recorded their behavior with quiet attention. Even simple movements such as crossed arms, restless legs, and lowered eyes were noted as signs of tension. Nothing felt casual. Everything was watched. It became clear to many patients that the place was designed not just for examination but for judgment. As they were led deeper inside, the controlled environment became more rigid. Rooms were arranged in narrow rows with doors that shut heavily. Windows were placed high on the walls, too high to see the street outside. The furniture was sparse, built more for durability than comfort. A woman lying on a treatment bed felt exposed even when draped with cloth, because the design left no space that felt personal. The clinics communicated their purpose without speaking. A woman was meant to be quiet, still, and compliant. For those sent in for emotional disturbances, the procedures performed often felt disconnected from the reasons they had been brought there. A woman who arrived because she cried too easily might be subjected to cold water immersion. Another who complained of exhaustion might be placed under bright lights or heavy blankets meant to correct her nerves. None of these interventions addressed the confusion, grief, or frustration she carried. Instead, they created new layers of discomfort under the claim of medical necessity. Some women spoke later of the silence that dominated these clinics. It was not peaceful silence, but controlled silence, the kind that pressed into every corner of the building. In the hallways, footsteps sounded too loud. In rooms, breaths felt restrained. Women waiting for treatment rarely spoke to one another, partly because they were discouraged, and partly because the environment made conversation feel inappropriate. The structure of the place seemed engineered to prevent connection. Isolation was not a side effect of treatment. It was built into the design. Behind closed doors, the procedures could feel harsher. Cold packs were applied to limbs without explanation. Electric stimulation devices were placed along the spine or near the temples, causing involuntary reactions that frightened many patients. Doctors described these methods as calming the system, though the experience left women shaking, fatigued, or dazed. The more distressed a woman appeared afterward, the more staff interpreted her response as further evidence of her instability. The cycle reinforced itself. In some cases, women were left in small rooms to settle. These spaces often contained only a bed, a chair, and a basin. The walls were unadorned, the air felt stale. Women lay there for hours, listening to faint sounds of movement outside. Carts rolling doors, closing distant murmurs. But no one explained how long they would remain, or what would happen next. Nurses entered occasionally to check pulses or offer brief instructions, then left again. The quiet became heavy, as though the room itself pressed against the patient. To many women, the most difficult part of these clinics was the loss of autonomy. Once inside, their choices diminished rapidly. They could not ask about procedures without appearing resistant. They could not refuse instructions without risking further intervention. Even simple requests like asking for more time, fresh air, or privacy could be interpreted as symptoms. The building's polished appearance concealed this imbalance of power, but the women inside felt it with each passing hour. Observers of the era sometimes commented on how orderly these clinics appeared. They noted the cleanliness, the structure, and the professionalism of the staff. But these same observers rarely witnessed the strain on the women inside. They did not see the trembling after a shock session, or the way patients hesitated before entering a treatment room. They did not hear the muffled crying or the subdued breaths of women trying not to draw attention. The clinics succeeded in maintaining their image because the suffering they produced was contained behind walls. For many patients, what lingered long after discharge was not the treatment itself, but the sense of being controlled in ways they could not articulate. They returned home quieter, more cautious, more aware that their actions could send them back. Families often interpreted this silence as improvement, believing the clinic had restored balance. In truth, many women simply learned the cost of failing to meet expectations. Everything described here shows how these clinics concealed discomfort and coercion under a polished surface meant to inspire trust. And as their reputation grew, they spread practices that blended moral judgment with medical authority, tightening control over women's lives. Beyond those restrained corridors, another set of beliefs waited. Beliefs that used faith and virtue to justify even deeper silence. Inside many communities of the period, the conversation surrounding hysteria was shaped not only by medicine, but by beliefs rooted in religion and morality. Women were often told that emotional strain, exhaustion, or restlessness reflected not a disturbance within their circumstances, but a flaw within their character. Leaders in churches preached that women suffered because their hearts were fragile, their discipline insufficient, and their faith incomplete. These ideas settled deeply into households, influencing how families interpreted a woman's behavior long before she ever entered a clinic. A woman who cried too easily was said to be overwhelmed by guilt. A woman who felt anxious was told she lacked spiritual grounding. A woman who questioned her role or expressed dissatisfaction was quietly judged for failing to accept her duties. These judgments were not always spoken aloud, yet they shaped the way she was treated. In many homes, a woman's moral standing was assessed through her composure, and any deviation became a matter of religious concern. When physicians diagnosed hysteria, families often accepted the label because it aligned with teachings they already believed. Religious writings described women as naturally vulnerable to temptation and imbalance. Sermons warned that emotional outbursts signaled inner weakness. Mothers raised daughters with these ideas, and daughters grew into adults who feared their own reactions. A simple moment of frustration could feel like failing both morally and spiritually. This fear pushed many women toward compliance because resisting the expectations set upon them felt like resisting the teachings they had been raised to honor. Clinics absorbed these beliefs into their structure. Staff members spoke in calm, authoritative tones about a woman's struggle using language that blurred the line between medical evaluation and spiritual correction. Some doctors insisted that emotional steadiness was a sign of virtue, while emotional difficulty indicated failing resolve. Women undergoing treatment found themselves encouraged to reflect not on their environment or circumstances, but on their supposed weaknesses. Treatments intended to modify behavior were framed as purifying the inner self. The layout of certain clinics contributed to this sense of moral correction. Walls were bare spaces, quiet, and routines strict. Patients were expected to endure discomfort without complaint. This endurance was sometimes interpreted as progress, as though compliance revealed growing moral strength. The more a woman submitted to the clinic's demands, the more she was praised for improving. The less she reacted, the more her caretakers believed the treatment was working. These interpretations ignored basic human responses and instead focused on shaping behavior that matched religious ideals of restraint. Many families encouraged treatment not because they believed their daughters or wives were ill, but because they feared scandal. A woman's emotional expression could be viewed as a failing that reflected poorly upon the household. Seeking medical intervention allowed families to present themselves as attentive and responsible, even if the woman's difficulties were caused by grief, exhaustion, or imposed expectations. By sending her to a clinic, they claimed to be protecting her virtue, when in truth, they were protecting their reputation. Religious communities reinforced these decisions by praising families who acted swiftly. They commended fathers who took charge and husbands who insisted on correction. Women were urged to accept these decisions as demonstrations of care. Refusal could be interpreted as rebellion. Compliance, on the other hand, was praised as humility. This framework left women with few ways to express their own understanding of their emotions. Their internal experiences were overshadowed by interpretations imposed upon them. Some clinics adopted practices that resembled confession. Women were asked to recount moments of distress, with staff emphasizing the importance of honesty and humility. These sessions often focused less on understanding the woman's feelings and more on identifying supposed moral faults. Women were encouraged to attribute their reactions to impatience, vanity, or a lack of discipline. Treatments were then framed as helping them regain control over their moral state. The burden of silence also carried moral weight. Women were expected not to discuss their experiences with others, even with close acquaintances. Sharing complaints could be interpreted as gossip or ingratitude. Many learned to keep their thoughts hidden to avoid accusations of weakness. This silence further isolated them, making it difficult to challenge the authority of families, clergy, or physicians. The more isolated they became, the more easily they were guided toward treatment that had little to do with health and everything to do with conformity. In some communities, religious leaders visited clinics to observe or provide guidance. Their presence strengthened the belief that treatment was aligned with spiritual duty. Women undergoing procedures found themselves caught between medical authority and spiritual expectation. Each reinforced the other. Doctors spoke of nerves, while ministers spoke of self-control. Both messages pointed toward the same outcome: obedience. Those who questioned the system faced judgment. A woman who doubted the treatment risked being labeled defiant. A woman who resisted procedures risked being viewed as morally compromised. A woman who asked for explanations risked being interpreted as unstable. These responses left many women with no clear choices. They learned to remain quiet during treatment, to lower their eyes when questioned, and to avoid expressing discomfort. For many patients, the influence of religion and morality shaped not just their time in the clinic, but their understanding of themselves. They left with reinforced beliefs about their own fragility. They carried the expectation that their emotions required constant monitoring. They learned that silence preserved reputation while honesty threatened it. The clinic's polished walls concealed these effects, yet the weight of these teachings remained long after discharge. Everything described here shows how religious thinking allowed hysteria to be treated as a flaw of character rather than a reflection of circumstance. And as these beliefs blended with medical authority, they deepened the silence already surrounding women's experiences. Past those quiet rooms waited another layer of restraint, the silence of entire communities who chose not to intervene. In many towns of the period, the handling of hysteria did not depend solely on clinics or families, but on the broader community that surrounded them. Residents often moved through their days with an awareness that certain subjects were never to be questioned. When a woman disappeared into a treatment center for weeks or months, neighbors rarely spoke her name. People passed her home without asking why the shutters remained closed or why relatives avoided discussing her absence. The The silence did not come from ignorance, but from a sense of collective agreement that such matters were private and should remain unexamined. This silence shaped the experience of many women long before they entered treatment. A woman struggling with exhaustion or fear could not confide in acquaintances because she knew her feelings would be interpreted as potential instability. Even simple statements expressing worry about her health, describing restlessness, or admitting she felt overwhelmed carried risks. If mentioned to the wrong person, her words could reach relatives who might bring her to a clinic without asking for an explanation. As a result, many kept their thoughts hidden, learning to present a steady face, even when the weight of their emotions grew difficult to manage. Within households, silence served as a boundary. Families often instructed daughters not to speak about their experiences outside the home. Mothers emphasized the importance of dignity. Fathers insisted that personal matters remain contained. Husbands reminded wives that discussing private struggles could damage the family's standing. These expectations ensured that when a woman's behavior was questioned, the surrounding community had little context for understanding her distress. They saw only the surface: a woman struggling, a family taking responsible action, and a clinic providing care. When neighbors noticed that a woman had been taken away, they often responded with a brief nod of acknowledgement and then allowed the matter to fade. Some felt sympathy, but said nothing. Others assumed the family had made the correct decision. A few believed the woman's absence meant she had committed some unspecified moral error, but regardless of their private thoughts, they rarely expressed them openly. The unwritten rule was clear: do not interfere. This silence served as a shield for the institutions that handled hysteria. Clinics operated with little scrutiny because the community did not question their practices. People trusted the appearance of professionalism and assumed the staff acted in the best interest of their patients. They did not see the trembling after cold water immersion, the fatigue following shock treatments, or the fear that grew inside women placed in isolation. Without witnesses to challenge these methods, the clinics continued their routines unchanged. Even when women returned home visibly altered, quieter, slower, more cautious, the community rarely asked what had happened. Neighbors greeted them politely, but refrained from deeper conversation. Friends avoided sensitive topics. Families explained the change in behavior with vague comments about recovery. The woman's own understanding of what she endured remained unspoken, not because she lacked the words, but because she understood that speaking might bring consequences she wished to avoid. For younger women, observing these patterns, silence became a form of preparation. They learned that distress must be hidden. They learned that displaying too much emotion could lead to intervention. They learned that once a woman was labeled unstable, few people would defend her. This expectation followed them as they grew older, shaping how they responded to fear, sorrow, or frustration. Many learned to endure quietly, believing the alternative might lead them down the same path as the women they saw disappear into clinics. The community's silence also protected those who benefited from the system. Physicians who relied on certain treatments faced no challenge because their methods remained unexamined. Families who wished to control daughters or wives found support through the absence of public scrutiny. Religious leaders who reinforced moral expectations did not face pushback from congregations. This collective quiet ensured that the system surrounding hysteria remained stable even when individual lives were disrupted or harmed. Occasionally, a scandal reached public attention when multiple women in a single district were sent away, or when a particularly severe case attracted whispers. Yet even then, the conversation remained cautious. People discussed the matter in private, but rarely voiced concerns openly. The idea of questioning a family's decisions or a clinic's authority felt inappropriate. As these moments faded, the pattern of silence reasserted itself, and the community returned to its usual calm. For the women most affected, silence became an additional burden. They carried experiences that could not be shared. They lived with memories of treatment rooms and long hours of isolation that no one asked them to describe. They navigated social gatherings with subdued expressions, because expressing too much might lead relatives to reconsider the need for further intervention. Their world narrowed into routine and caution, shaped not only by clinics, but by the community that enabled their suffering through inaction. Across generations, this silence persisted. Mothers who once feared being labeled unstable later encouraged their daughters to behave cautiously to avoid suspicion. Communities passed down the expectation that emotional restraint signaled respectability. Even when medical practices changed over time, the social memory of silence remained. Women continued to move carefully through their lives, aware that speaking too openly could still attract unwanted scrutiny. The lingering effect of this collective quiet reveals how deeply hysteria was intertwined with social order. It was not merely a diagnosis, but a method of shaping behavior reinforced by communities that chose not to question the system. The absence of inquiry allowed treatment centers to operate without oversight and allowed families to act without accountability. This silence, maintained by thousands of small decisions across households and neighborhoods, ensured the endurance of a system that rarely served the women placed within it. Everything described here shows how silence operated not as ignorance, but as a choice that protected the structures surrounding hysteria. And as this quiet agreement held firm, it created a setting where the final consequence became almost inevitable for many women caught inside it. Past this long trail of unspoken acceptance waited the closing point of the story, the place where treatment ended not in recovery but in erasure. Standing outside one of those clinics at the end of a long day, a person might see only a quiet building resting behind pale windows and still curtains. The lamps near the entrance would cast a steady light on the stone steps, and nothing in the scene would suggest what had occurred behind the door. People would walk past without pausing. Carriages would move across the street at the same rhythm as always. The calm appearance offered no hint of the weight carried by the women leaving those halls. To anyone watching casually, the building was simply part of the neighborhood. To those who stepped inside for treatment, it became something they never forgot. Many women ended their final hours in the clinic with a sense of resignation that had grown slowly over days or weeks. The staff spoke to them with measured voices, explaining that their time in treatment had reached a point where they were ready to return home. These explanations sounded like routine instructions, but the women often sensed a different layer beneath them. Each reminder about composure and steadiness sounded less like medical guidance and more like expectation. They were told to avoid stress, to manage their emotions, and to remain orderly. These messages lingered with them long after the conversation ended. Walking down the hallway toward the exit, women often moved carefully, as though reacting too quickly might provoke someone to reconsider their discharge. The hall looked the same as on the first day, controlled lighting, silent rooms on either side, and staff passing without acknowledgement. But a woman leaving the clinic carried impressions that changed the way she saw these details. She noticed the weight of the air, the controlled quiet, the stiffness of each step. The building no longer felt like a place of correction. It felt like a place she needed to leave without drawing attention. Once outside, the world greeted her without ceremony. The sound of wheels, distant voices, and evening breeze flowed around her, as though nothing had happened. This contrast often intensified her unease. She had endured procedures, isolation, and constant observation, yet the street offered no recognition of it. She walked home slowly, trying to re-enter a routine that no longer felt familiar. People nearby did not ask where she had been. Neighbors glanced politely, but did not comment. Silence met her at every corner. Inside, the home relatives tended to speak in vague terms. They asked whether she felt steadier. They said they were glad she was back. They did not ask about her time in the clinic. They did not ask about treatments or how she had felt during isolation. These omissions were not accidental. Families preferred to maintain distance from the details, believing that not asking prevented discomfort. Women learned quickly that their experiences existed in a space without listeners. At night, sleep returned slowly. Women often lie awake, hearing the faint sounds of the house settling, remembering the controlled stillness of the clinic. The memory surfaced in small fragments: the closing of a door, the faint echo of steps on tile, the sensation of lying still because movement invited questions. These memories drifted through their thoughts without sharp edges, but they settled deeply. Some women woke before dawn, starting their morning routines early, to avoid notice, keeping their movements measured, as though the clinic's rules had followed them home. Families interpreted these quiet habits as signs of improvement. They believed reduced emotion meant recovery. They believed stillness meant health. A woman who spoke less was considered balanced. A woman who suppressed frustration was considered stable. And when she avoided describing her experience, relatives assumed the clinic had helped her regain a sense of order. They rarely understood that the quiet came from caution rather than healing. Women adapted because adaptation reduced suspicion. They lowered their voices, softened their reactions, and kept their expressions even. They navigated daily life with awareness that emotional openness might draw renewed concern. Some avoided gatherings where they might feel overwhelmed. Others practiced careful responses during conversation, offering small, polite expressions that revealed nothing. In this way, They shaped themselves into versions of calm that met expectations, but left their interior lives untouched. The community's silence created the final boundary. Neighbors rarely mentioned a woman's absence. They accepted that she had been taken for treatment and returned without discussing what that meant. Some felt pity but spoke none of it. Others believed the clinic had done what was necessary, and a few quietly judged the woman for whatever behavior had prompted intervention. But even in judgment, they did not speak directly. The rules of the time demanded distance. This silent agreement shielded the institutions at the center of these events. Clinics continued operating without scrutiny. Their procedures remained unexamined. Staff did not face questions about the moments when women trembled after a cold bath, or the hours they spent lying still after shock treatments, or the strain that marked their faces after isolation. The building's quiet order ensured that the outside world never witnessed these scenes. For women who returned home, the changes were subtle but lasting. They became more cautious in their movements, more restrained in their speech, more careful with their emotions. Some withdrew from activities they once enjoyed. Others maintained routines, but did so with a muted energy. A few found moments of ease, but the memory of the clinic's control lingered beneath them. The impression formed slowly: life must be lived within narrow lines. As years passed, the medical theories around hysteria shifted. Devices were replaced, procedures changed, some clinics are closed. But the effect remained within the women who lived through them. They carried forward the understanding that emotion had consequences, that desire for expression risked intervention, and that silence protected them. Their daughters learned these lessons indirectly, observing the restraint of the women who raised them. Their communities passed down expectations, quietly maintaining the patterns that had shaped earlier generations. Looking at such a clinic now, imagining it in the late hours of the day, brings forward the same contrast seen by any observer who understood its history. The white walls, the quiet windows, and the still air hid more than they revealed. These buildings were not places where illness was treated. They were places where conformity was enforced. Their rooms were arranged to keep women contained. Their routines were designed to limit expression. Their methods functioned not to heal but to restrain. As night settles over the memory of these spaces, the picture becomes clearer. Women left the clinic with steps that seemed steady because steady steps were expected. They learned to move quietly because quiet movement drew less attention. They learned to rest without complaint because complaint encouraged doubt. The weight of that learning remained long after the door closed behind them. And now, in this final moment, it is time to let the story drift into the same quiet where so many voices were kept. Take a slow breath. Let the heaviness settle without fear. Allow the night to soften around you in a way those women were never granted. Sleep without the pressure they carried. Rest without the silence they were forced into. Let the darkness bring calm instead of control. Good night.